rates. You can charge an appropriate amount per hour for the vehicle that's being parked there, as opposed to really a rather considerable bargain now. And you can create some turnover. If somebody looks at the electronic meter and after they've stuck their credit card into it, and they see that it's going to cost them $4 to 2 hours, they might decide to leave after an hour and a half, or and make room for the next person. And indeed, because they are high-demand spaces, the slot will be filled by somebody else. The question that's always raised by the merchant community is, isn't this going to kill us? Or this will kill us. They'll make an affirmative statement. And the answer is that if somebody had to carry around a backpack full of quarters, put 16 quarters in for 2 hours, it might very well be a problem for, but if people are coming in and putting a credit card into a meter, as they typically are doing in those meters, they don't really think very much about the cost. There are meters in other cities, other municipalities that are charging, for example, I'll give you an example that will make you all gasp, $6 an hour in San Francisco for spaces that are actually a few blocks off of Market Street. So, and the San Francisco's experience is, and other municipalities' experience is, that people will pay that because they don't have to actually take cash out of their pockets. They don't really think very much about it. So that's my combination transportation revenue pitch. I'm currently on the advisory committee, and revenue is a very important thing, therefore, in my mind. And as I say, from a transportation policy perspective, this is something we actually asked the selectmen to do about 3 years ago, the last time when we put in the kiosks and the Red Sox fee parking. And we weren't able to get traction then. Hopefully, the current situation will make us rethink. Any questions?
Yeah, Michael, so we have actually talked about this a little bit on revenue, and we weren't able to get utilization rates by time and location, which is what we thought we really needed in order to address the question. Does the Transportation Board have that? Because we were
I
told
would
you
think that
didn't.
the Transportation Administrator, Todd Curran, would be able to give that to you.
Oh, I didn't see you were here.
We asked for that.
You did. You asked Todd for that?
We are.
Sometimes it's a matter of who you ask.
We've only talked to Todd.
You did. Okay. All right. I'm surprised that he couldn't give you that. He should. He should be able to give you revenue by section. Anyway, I'm sure that he's got some kind of breakdown. But
So we have to start, but thank you.
Sure.
People can ask, oh, sorry.
Can I just ask one question?
Yeah.
My sense is that the
Former head of the
Red Sox parking is still a lot cheaper.
Department of the Transportation.
yes, that's certainly something that could be bumped up.
And I'm just wondering if you think there's potential to jack that up.
It could certainly go up another $5, and the collection would rise, not fall. Nobody would avoid using those spaces.
I see people walking as far as that.
Okay, thank you. I apologize for bouncing in. Thank you for the courtesy of the 5 minutes.
All right.
So, I'm ready. And nothing,
Trying to remember if I put
nothing personal with that side of the table. I'm just sitting at a place that I can get up and stretch.
No, it's fine.
So, there are no minutes?
Nope.
Okay.
We don't have anybody dialing in, but we do have a quorum, so we're excited to go.
Okay. So the first item is the further discussion of items from February 10th, from our last meeting. And I know that there's at least one item for further discussion, and that is a discussion about long-run incremental cost and methodology, and as somebody has described it, the battle of the PhDs. But I'm not sure the bottom line is that far apart.
First, I want to make sure, Lee, did you got my email? Good. So I want to just make a plea to avoid, I guess, two things. One is what I would call the fallacy of excess concreteness, that there's a lot of uncertainty about the numbers, and putting any number at the level of $1 is inappropriate. And the second thing is to, let me step back. I've argued in front of the school subcommittee that I've tried to explain why it is that I don't believe the approach that Lee has used is scientifically valid. And the response that I've had from a number of people is, well, the number looks good. The number looks reasonable. And I'm actually not that far off from agreeing that the marginal cost number looks reasonable, but I submit to you that you would ask a lot more questions if it didn't have an aura of being scientific. And I think we can get to a number that is consistent with our degree of ignorance that is useful without relying on something that I personally consider scientifically invalid. It's hard to look at our budget and find that somehow adding students is going to be more expensive than average cost. I would think that would be the upper end of what's really plausible. It's hard to look at our budget and think that marginal cost in the long run, I'm not talking about the short run, but it's hard to believe that in the long run we wouldn't adjust a fairly high fraction of the expenditures to account for additional students. So I would think a low estimate would be 70% of average cost. If you wanted to narrow those ranges, I wouldn't disagree. I would argue that we should probably focus on the operating cost, and because I think the capital questions are much more complex. I think the capital subcommittee is looking into those things, and the lumpiness and the difference between adding students and subtracting students are all very important there. But I think if we were to just settle on 70 to 100% is the reasonable range, and maybe focus on 85% of average cost in the middle, we would get numbers that are close enough to work with. We could take the average cost number from the state, although that includes some CIP, or we could take the total costs minus CIP as calculated by Lee. I would insist that we divide by all of the students, not just the regular students, because those costs, the costs that are in his total costs include out-of-district, so we have to include the out-of-district students. They include early childhood, so we have to include the early childhood students. And if we do that, we get a number of about 16,500. Again, at a level of accuracy that I would consider reasonable. And so I would argue take 70% of that, and you have a range of 11,500 to 16,500, which is not very far, by the way, from Lee's range once you do the two corrections that I think are essential. And I would argue, let's just use those numbers. Let's not claim that we can be a great deal more accurate than we can. So that's how I would go for marginal cost. In terms of the difference between the marginal cost of the average student and the marginal cost of non-resident students, again, I would urge us to avoid the fallacy of excess concreteness. I think that Lee has done something very useful in showing that if you take a couple of big factors, you can get a difference of $1,000. But there are a whole bunch of other things. If we're going to go with a very precise number, there are a whole bunch of questions, additional questions I would want to ask. Right? How do the medical costs? Right? How many METCO and other non-resident students are coming with their own nurse versus our resident students? How many are in ELL versus our relative to our other students? A number of people have suggested that greater flexibility in the assignment of students to districts would lower our costs. We have more flexibility for non-resident students. How much is that worth? Guidance, I think, may be more expensive for METCO students. I would want to look at that. how does reducing the number of METCO and other non-resident students affect our kindergarten grant? I'd want to know the answer to that. Factor in steps to success, which I believe non-resident students are not eligible for. How does circuit breaker, right? A big factor in Lee's higher costs or special education. How much circuit breaker money do we get for the METCO and other non-resident students? Would changing the number of non-resident students affect Title I? And we can go on and on. If we want to be precise, we can do a lot more work and get numbers that are going to end up being somewhere within several $100s of the average costs that I've suggested that we use. Right? So my strong suggestion to this committee is not to get into a debate about can we make a better model, can we get more precise figures, because I don't think in the end our decision is going to matter a whole lot as to whether the marginal cost is $11,500 minus $500, so $11,000 for non-resident students, or $16,500 plus $500. If we want to look at $11,000 to $17,000, fine. If we want to look at $12,000 to $16,000, fine. But we should settle on what we think is a reasonable range from all of us having looked at the budgets. The lower end of that range, I think once you ramp up the increases in salaries over time, actually I think includes Beth's estimate. So I think it gives us a pretty good range for long-run long-run marginal cost. And I would just argue to go with that. And if Lee is comfortable with his model and it makes him more comfortable to have that range coming out of his model, that's fine with me, but I don't want it to be the basis on which I commit to a set of numbers.
Can I respond? I don't want to turn this into a battle of the PhDs. I agree with that. And in a way, I also sort of feel that I'm not really sure why this conversation is even taking place. A couple of sort of first level observations. My number, what I'm calling my best estimate of long-run marginal cost is roughly 90% of average cost. So it's at the high end of the range that Kevin has suggested. The average cost for FY 14 was $18,080, and my number is $16,367. It's 90.5%. Okay, so I don't see that we're that far off. I totally reject this notion that Kevin has expressed that you can't end up with a situation where average cost is higher. I'm sorry, where marginal cost or incremental cost is higher than average cost, because, in fact, when we're dealing with the kind of situation that we have, where we are basically bursting at the seams and having to invest in additional capital in order to increase capacity, that's not an unreasonable expectation. And just to sort of illustrate, I don't put much credence in this because it was a fairly simple, almost back of an envelope level of analysis. But I went on the state website and I pulled the DOE website and I pulled the pupil population and total as reported to the state expenditure for I think it was whatever the most recent year they have. I think it was FY12 if I recall correctly. And I just took a very simple regression of those two factors to just without and I realize that's what I'm saying, that there are obviously other things going on, but I just wanted to sort of see how cost and pupil population tracked. And what was interesting there is I got a very high R-square. I think it was around 4.96 or 0.97, very close to the number that we have here. And most interesting is that the intercept term was actually negative, which would certainly suggest that the increment there, that is, as the population increased, the cost actually increased by proportionally more than the increase in population. There's just no evidence to support Kevin's hypothesis that the upper bound of incremental cost is average cost. And I think there's evidence to the contrary. In particular, if in fact, as Kevin has pointed out, our spending is revenue constrained, and that if we had more revenue, we would be spending more, that's, further reason to expect incremental cost. If anything, my estimate is on the low side, not on the high side. The fact that we're talking about a budget, about a tax override, which would alleviate the revenue constraint, or other shifts in the town-school partnership allocation has a similar effect. I think from that perspective, that's just simply wrong. I looked at his technical challenges to a so-called bootstrap approach, and I attempted to replicate it. By the way, I should point out, throughout this process, I have been completely transparent. I have provided you with every bit of data that I've used, every analysis that I've conducted. I've been completely open about it. There's no secret. And my work can be reproduced. Kevin has produced none of that, so I don't know what he's done. All I know is that when you do the bootstrap approach, that necessarily involves taking a sample or using a random number generator to take successive regressions, and basically each time you do it, you get a different result. And I did it 4 times, and I got 4 different results, all of which were good, by the way. The notion that somehow or other this disproves what I've done is just nonsense. Now, on to some of the specifics in his criticisms.
So can I ask a question
Yeah.
before you keep going? So I guess what I want to ask the committee is, do we feel like we need to understand the technical aspects and agree on the technical aspects as a committee, or do we want to set that aside and agree on a practical range and move on? Because I think if we want to do the first, we need to we need to do that, right? If we all want to understand and accept, get to one model, and there's probably more investment and discussion that's needed to do that. If it's a matter of getting to a practical range and saying, we're not going to come to consensus on how we got to this range, but for different people have gotten to the same set of numbers using different methodologies, and as a practical matter, that's what we're going with.
Well,
So-
I think we're there. I mean,
Right, so I guess my question-
that's my point. At the end of the day,
Right, so that's my question to the committee.
despite basically throwing a lot of rocks at what I've done, I think basically we're coming out at the same place. But I do want to address some of his specific criticisms about this degree of granularity in my analysis. I have throughout this process, I have attempted I've gotten many suggestions from a number of you, and have attempted to incorporate them, such as, for example, addressing the issue of the METCO, of how to deal with the METCO grant revenue and applying it correctly. On the issue of the pre-K, here's the deal with the pre-K. I did not include the pre-K population, and I did that somewhat deliberately. It wasn't an oversight. The cost per pre-K is well below the average, as I understand it. It seems to be, from what we've been hearing, it's somewhere in the range of closer to about $10,000, which is roughly what the tuition is. About half of the total pre-K students actually pay tuition. So if we take the cost that is actually borne, the net cost, net of revenue, we're looking at roughly a little under 300 kids, and about roughly $5,000 or so on average is what the school department is incurring. So if we were to adjust for pre-K, and I don't, by the way, have any problem with adjusting for pre-K, but it has to be done correctly. And to do it correctly, what you would actually do is take the net cost and allocate that to pre-K. And then in the same way that I've made allocations of special ed, make allocations to pre-K, because pre-K is distinctly different from the rest of the analysis. I'm perfectly happy to do that. I think the effect is going to be a fairly small, probably in the range of about $100 or $150. But if I had the data, I can do that. The issue of flexibility. we've been through this round and round, and the reality is that there is no flexibility. The flexibility at most seems to be associated with about 20 of the 40 or so entering kindergarten kids, because the other 20 are siblings, and they end up being put in the same school. Once they're in the program, there's no flexibility at all. It's no different than any other student. And as for the 20, to the extent that those are assigned to schools ahead of some Brookline kids that sign up after April, if anything, that there's less flexibility. So that makes no, that argument simply has no merit. Notes here. Medical costs. Again, if we had data for that, that's easy to address. The point is that these various adjustments are successively smaller and smaller. I have attempted to focus on the major adjustments. I've assigned the out-of-district entirely to Brookline. I've assigned the district-wide entirely to Brookline. I've assigned the rest of special ed in proportion to the relative use, but if that can be done more granularly, we can do that. But again, these refinements don't materially change the numbers. They may change them slightly, certainly not by the kind of range that Kevin is describing. If we're looking, the issue, he just suggested, I hadn't heard this one before, it wasn't in his notes, that we should exclude the CIP portion from the costs. I just don't see any justification for that. We have capital expenditures falling into two categories. There are capital expenditures that are funded by debt, and there's debt service, and that's certainly included in the town share of the cost that I've added in. And then there's the CIP pay-as-you-go, which is basically funded out of current operating revenues. And Sean Cronin has indicated to me that his best estimate, and that's what I'm relying on, is that roughly 20% on average of these pay-as-you-go CIP costs are associated with school-related activities, and I've incorporated that. I've also incorporated the other non-benefit related town expenses, such as for building maintenance and other things that are covered in the town portion. I've attempted to address all of these things, if there's more data available, my model is sufficiently, the way I've set it up is I can add these things anytime, very easily, as long as I have the data for it. But, there comes a point where, and I suppose in this sense I agree with Kevin that this, you reach a level where adding these refinements just doesn't do very much. But I am totally confident that in the manner in which the special ed costs, which represent a huge portion of the total school budget, and that I've attempted to allocate them as between residents, as among residents, METCO, and materials fee, is appropriate. And I think the way I've done it, confining the allocation, the portion only to the portion of special ed that is used by METCO and materials fee students, is the correct way to do it.
I think just going back to Susan's question, I've been doing some, I've been using my computer here. And taking the 80 to 90% seemingly most plausible range from Kevin, I get $15,368, 85% of average cost being $18,080, if that's the number. So $15,368 versus Lee's $16,367. That is $999 difference. I think in terms of the policy determinations that are going to have to be made, that policy decisions are not going to turn on $999 in that range. I will say that if you're trying to put a range around that, to be fair, I think, Lee's analysis does provide justification as opposed to saying, well, 70% sounds reasonable, or,
That one I have to respond to. It sounds scientifically correct, but the fact that it sounds scientifically correct doesn't make it scientifically
yeah.
correct.
But I don't know what, what the basis would be to say long-run marginal cost is unlikely to be less than 70% or, more than whatever percent. That being said, I think, you've got the range from one model, but you've got the two midpoints from the two models or approaches or whatever you want to call them, and I don't think that there's a substantial difference between them from the point of view of policy decisions.
In the interest of moving things along, and because in terms of, whether we're looking at a $109 million exposure or $104 million exposure, it really doesn't much matter. I'd say fine, use whichever number the committee is comfortable with. At the same time, I totally reject the argument that my approach is unscientific, because I think that at least it has some formality to it rather than just pulling numbers out of the air and basing it on theories that haven't been proven. It's a reasonable estimate, I think, and I take Kevin's revenue constraint argument seriously, and in that sense, I think it's a low estimate. Because if you remove the revenue constraint, as we are here for the express purpose of doing, that number's going to go up, not down.
So let me just say a couple things quickly, please. I accept Lee's last argument. I think that's right. I want to say one thing we do disagree about is how to treat capital. I never said you shouldn't consider capital. I basically said I think you need to treat capital in a different way. Okay, in the capital subcommittee, we should not treat it as a constant. In fact, precisely for the reasons that Lee talked about, capital might indeed increase our marginal cost above average cost. And that's another reason I think it should be treated differently. And so that, I think in terms of a conceptual issue here, that would be the one thing that I would think is a major difference in terms of where we stand, is I think we should come up with a number for the operating budget, let the capital committee tell us what the kind of issues are around the capital budget, because those seem to me to be extremely complex, and there's probably a huge range there, but I defer to the capital committee that's been looking at that.
Yeah,
Make one sort of amendment to that, so I would say that for the policy number, when we're conceptually trying to understand what is this cost, I don't mind including it to sort of have an all-in cost. I think when we start to think about what are the budget implications of some of the things that we're recommending, then I do agree with Kevin. I think you need to untie them. And we need to think, and I also believe that whatever scenario we're talking about, I mean, we haven't come to a conclusion as a committee as to what we think our recommendations might be, but there's several different scenarios that might be possible here, and in my mind, the scale of the number of students actually matters for the number that we choose. And the greater the scale, I think the closer we get to Lee's number. I think if we're talking about a relatively smaller reduction in students, I think that the marginal cost per student is less because of the lumpiness of the costs. So again, I mean, the way I view it is the policy number, I take a different approach than I do the budget number.
Let me just make one observation on capital, just so it's clear. The capital translates into an annual budgetary obligation. And that is captured in the costs that I used in my analysis. Now, this comes in two ways. If it's bonded, then we are capturing in the current year's budget the debt service, which includes both the interest and the amortization of principal. That's in there. If it's in the pay-as-you-go CIP, then it's a one-shot amount, which is you know, you want to call it capital, you want to call it an expense. You know, in IRS terminology, certain capital expenses that fall under Section 179 can be expensed in the year in which they are incurred, and that's sort of what's going on here. The town allocates a certain amount of the annual budget to relatively small capital programs, and that too is also captured. Now, you know, you can those can be. We could translate that, by the way, into a rental equivalent. In other words, we can take those and sort of pseudo capitalize them and calculate what the annual debt service would be. But that's not the way the budget works, which is why I don't think it's appropriate to do that. And also, if you're doing it on an ongoing basis, at the end of the day, you end up in more or less the same place. So, you know, I think that my approach is going to tell you what the annual budget implication is, including the capital portion. And I completely agree. We need to understand, separate and apart, because we're looking at a debt override. So we have to understand what the upfront capital outlay is going to be and how much is going to have to be funded by debt. But from a budgetary standpoint, capital becomes an annual operating cost, and that's captured.
The sense that I have is that Lee's analysis and the analysis that Lisa presented really, as I think you indicated, Beth, they're going to be presented. They're on parallel tracks. I think.
They're not mutually exclusive. They
Exactly.
answer different questions.
Exactly. They are not mutually exclusive, and the implications of policy changes or potential policy changes for classroom needs will not only have budgetary and override implications, but they'll also have implications for a lot of the political discussion that is out there now about changes to particular schools. And so I think, you know, I think that in a sense, the theoretical long-term framework and the overall budgetary, the all-in budgetary framework is presented by Lee's number or, you know, Kevin's number, which are not significantly different, but the kind of on-the-ground capital needs and capital decisions that would have to be made are, I think, presented by Lisa's.
Right, and I think that capturing the CIP and the 20% CIP is reasonable. I mean, we can argue whether it's 20%, but I know that's a number that Sean has given you. So, because I think, you know, there is ongoing capital costs that we're not looking at. We're looking at sort of the big projects that would require either, if they were to be funded through the CIP, would be meaningful in terms of other projects in the town. So, and also the fact that, you know, you're looking at a number of significant projects coming online at the same time. So I think that, you know, to parse, I don't think you'd want to necessarily try to parse out Runkle or some of the projects that have had debt exclusion from this overall CIP number, only because the number is so dwarfed by the operating that I don't think it's a worthwhile effort. But I do think that we can't treat the going forward in the same way, because we do have we're talking about at least 3 very significant projects coming on. But just as a reminder, they're nowhere near as significant as the operating.
So I think I'm hearing a couple things. One is, and stop me anytime, the majority of us aren't sort of on board with this. I mean, one is that the theoretical, long-term policy number and framework and the budgetary framework are on parallel tracks and they need different analyses. I think that's one thing I'm hearing. I think the second thing I'm hearing is on the policy number that the long-run cost is in a particular range that Lee and Kevin can agree on. I'm not actually sure. I heard a few different ranges, but maybe the two of you can pass a sheet of paper back and forth and give us a range by the end of this discussion. But
I think the number that came up is we can live with. Right?
so 15.5 to
15.3.
16.5? What was,
What was your number?
It was
15,368 to 16,367, but that's going, and no sense.
I will object to anything that has more than 2 digits followed by some number of zeros.
right, so that's what, so let me, if it's a friendly
How about
amendment, 15.5 to
16.5?
16.5? Too much, 15 to
15 to
17?
17.
Well, 17 is higher than that, I think,
Well,
no?
If you're
15 to
keeping the
17?
capital in, then 17 seems fine.
Fine, so 15 to, stop, 15 to 17, we have agreement, don't talk anymore.
Totally,
Okay.
do you want to totally
so
lose
what-
Wait,
that
stop,
number?
stop,
Because
stop.
15 loses.
What is this number?
Okay, one second, I want to be clear on what the number is. Come on.
But Kevin just made a point. He said, do you want to totally lose Beth's number because my number, but I would say that my number is
It's
different
short-term
for
budget
a
number.
very good reason.
There's no loss of your number.
Right, it's not, they're apples and oranges.
Right, so can I just, let me go back to statement one. Statement one is the theoretical long-term policy number is different from the years 1 through 5 budgetary number, okay? Because I think that both of them are very important, but you get there totally different ways.
But
The
we
policy-
don't have years 2 through 5 budgetary numbers. The only budgetary number we have is a year 1 budgetary.
Would you
number.
agree that however you get to years 2 through 5, it's going to be on a different methodology?
It's going to converge to the long run.
Correct. It will asymptotically converge to the long run.
don't have-
And we don't know how fast it will titrate, okay? So we're all agreed. So the theoretical policy number is very important. Lee's analysis and Kevin's analysis, however you want to get there, and I think we don't have to agree on the methodology, and I please God do not make us. There's a robust debate. Everyone got up the mountain a different way, but the top of the mountain is $15,000 to $17,000 as a long-term policy number that you can use to calculate the policy decision around any student, around Metco, materials fee, Hancock Village, somebody who just moved into the district. It doesn't matter. That's the long-term policy number of a student. Okay. That's different from saying the budget implication in any given year, how you actually get there. Operating has to be decoupled from capital. They have to get built up. As Lee says, it will asymptotically approach this $15,000 to $17,000 range with some degree of rapidity, which
The
I don't.
operating number, the numbers coming out of my analysis are budgetary type numbers and include the annual debt service or rental equivalent of capital.
Correct. As a policy matter, that's right. But as a budgetary number, I think what we're all agreeing on is that that's a different methodology, right? When you're trying to do year 1, year 2, year 3, it's a different methodology, or this specific capital cost, which is different from the average
But you're
capital
correct
cost.
that the year 1, 2, and 3, to the extent that that capital costs aren't avoidable in that short a time frame, can't capture on an incremental basis any capital-driven or any other fixed cost for that matter. I mean, there are other costs that don't.
Presumably, you could capture some.
You could capture, for example, we talked about this the other day. If when the lease on this beep space is up, then that does sort of translate into a capital item.
Or you could capture capital conversions, capital classroom
Right, correct.
build-out, things of that sort.
Correct. So there is some of that.
Right. So I guess what I'm asking us to, if we agree on, and maybe we don't, but I thought we did, was that the long-term policy number and the year-by-year budgetary framework are different analyses, that over time, the year-by-year budget should approach the long-term number, but how that actually happens needs to get built, because it depends on the actual capital projects and the actual operations, and it needs to approach it, but you can't just use one, you can't plug in one number to the other analysis.
If we were not expanding capacity, and we were simply living with existing capacity over an extended period of time, then those two would not approach. It is precisely because we are expanding capacity that the numbers will approach.
I don't agree with that, but I think I get there a different way. But yes, I agree they approach. Any other, are we, is that more or less?
Can a non-PhD add to this conversation?
Knock yourself out.
So I just want to ask if Kevin and Lee's conclusions might differ given Dr. Lupini's FY15 budget message. On page 20, on page 7 of 23, he discloses that the full tuition students, tuition charge would increase from 14,000 to 16.5, so 16,500. So the way I view that is that that would be a floor, because as in years with inflation, this number is only going to go up. And if the town cannot charge more than 100% cost recovery, that means that it actually will cost at least 16.5. Is that not?
I think, to be fair, I think
I
that
think
that's based on
Wait.
average cost, not on incremental
Well,
cost.
actually, I'm just going to, I don't want to speak for the schools, but I'll just give you my own experience. So that number is a number that really is not charged to very many people. So for example, a couple of years ago, we hosted someone who came to Brookline to go to school for a year from Spain. And this is what her family was charged for her to be able to go to school here. My understanding is that that number is kind of sticky. It doesn't really change much from year to year, and I'm not sure that I would use it as a basis for anything in our discussions.
Yeah, Peter, do you want to speak to this and sort of say, what is that number? We've gotten a legal opinion about how much we can charge for that number. There's a lot of backstory to this, which is largely what Cliff said.
Yeah, no,
but-
just to
yeah.
let you know, that's the FY12 per pupil number generated on the website by the Department of Education. So when they take our reports, as they do from all communities, they calculated out one number that was our per pupil number. We shared that with you in our presentation. It was 16.5. So they haven't yet released the data from last year. So we decided that we would pick that number because it represents the, if you will, the full cost that we could charge. So we're just trying to maximize that number. So that's why we picked it.
But that's, again, an average cost. It's not, it does, yeah,
Right.
it's an
But as
average
long
cost.
as
It's not
we're-
an incremental cost.
Great, but as long as we don't, we're agreed, we don't have to sign off on any one or the other methodology, I think we might be able to bring this portion of the meeting to a close.
I think we are at a close already, unless somebody feels otherwise.
What I will do, Susan, is I will, if we're agreed on this 15 to 17 range, I will rerun that scenarios analysis and substitute that range for the one I have.
Okay, and maybe you
And
and
also I'll
Kevin.
use the 16,000.
That's fine,
as
and
the-
maybe
as the
you and
mid-
Kevin can talk about it and decide whether you agree on that number or not, and if you do, just submit it to us, and I think we would just be happy not to talk about it, and
I thought we just agreed to use that. I thought we just agreed to use that.
No, I mean your new analysis.
Well, no, I'm not going to change I'm not going to do anything with the regression.
Oh,
What I'm
sorry,
gonna
you
do
mean
is
just the calculation. Ah, okay.
Calculations.
Okay, fine. Great. Great, thank you.
All right,
Oh,
folks.
no,
Agreement is above the
you're not
number, not
reopening
below.
it, sorry.
Well, all right.
Okay.
I just have one question, which is, how far down on this asymptote does it have to be before it no longer has any budgetary impact? And Kevin, it seems to me, he was making a statement about an aggregate. So what I'm saying is, you're saying that as it increases, as the increase comes, it comes close together. In other words, would it make a difference to eliminate one student, 2 students,
I think that's the
3
point of the.
students?
That's Beth's point.
And no, I'm just going to put that there. I am very sorry, I could not be here Monday, and I just want to put that out there because I think that's going to be kind of a
Right.
taxpayer's
That's the
policy
point
answer
that, that I was
And- right,
making,
and I
that
don't-
why
all right,
for
okay.
the budget numbers, we will build up. And the more students that get included, the closer you get
Gets to that.
the 15 to 17.
Okay.
And the more years that go out, the closer you get to
Okay,
that number.
yeah.
Yes.
And along those same lines, the reason that I adopted the approach that I did and why I think it is valid is precisely because we are experiencing high rates of growth on an annual basis. If we were not, then this approach would not necessarily be valid. So what's relevant is not not a theoretical number of 1 or 2 or 3 more students, but what we're actually experiencing. And what we're actually experiencing is a couple of hundred per year. And on a persistent basis, and it's projected to continue that way for a while, which is why we're all here.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Moving, terrific. So I guess the question is on next steps. I feel like for the long-run policy thing, we have a clear sense of what's next. Lee's going to rerun that based on 15 to 17. Very grateful to both doctors for all of their work in getting us here. What is the next, I don't know where you all are on the model.
So what we decided to do in our last school subcommittee meeting was the first next step would be to lay out more concretely which various options we want to, or scenarios we want to explore. And then once we have that squared away, and once Peter and Bill and everyone sort of emerges from budget season, then we will begin to scrub the 2 to 5 year numbers. And if we could choose, I mean, at some point, if we could determine what the number of years out we're actually looking for. I mean, previously we had said 3, but now I'm hearing some people say 5. That would be helpful. But in any case, that is the process. So laying out options, and then at the end of March, beginning to work with Peter and Bill to actually cost that out, and collaborate with our colleagues on the capital side to do the same for capital.
That sound okay to everybody? Okay. Thank you very much, which leads right into the next agenda item, which is the Future OSC Timeline.
Right. I actually saw some somewhat plaintive notes from committee members saying,
Plaintiff is a perfect word.
am I
Having seen those notes.
am I conscripted for life? And
My wife asked me that question this morning.
My husband asks me that question every day.
So do my daughters.
And I thought, and Susan thought, that it would be an appropriate time actually to talk through timelines and deliverables, and where we're going at this point. We're obviously, there was a March 1st date, and we've made a report. The fiscal 15 budget to some extent has a life of its own, but there is a lot of work that has been going on in this committee. And the one thing that I didn't want to have happen is, with the pressure being off, the immediate time pressure being off, having us lose momentum. And what I would hope is that, and let me just lay this out in general terms, that we would proceed to pull together the work that's being done, the sort of work that we talked about today, the sort of work that Revenue is doing, and nail down numbers, the work that the Special Population Committee is doing, nail down numbers, work Capital is doing, and sort of pull together numbers and have these reports of the various committees brought to a conclusion or fruition. And I don't think, there may be some committees like demographics that want to keep on working through the summer, but in no smile. But
That one is a lifetime appointment, I think.
but just my thinking is that there is a period between now and the beginning of the summer, between now and May and early June, that a lot of this work can be brought into a format that is going to be in writing, that we can respond to things in writing, and some of it is already in writing, and we're going to see some of that today with respect to the CPA and real estate transfer tax. But that all of this work could get to that point, and then perhaps there would be something of a hiatus. There might be some work going on, but at some point, we are going to have to put together some sort of recommendation to the Board of Selectmen. And I don't know whether that can happen before the summer, but I don't want everything to get pushed off until after the summer. The timeline that we're looking at, and I see the chair of the Board of Selectmen and the chair of the school committee are here, I would think would be that by September or October, we would have pretty much the final deliverables, but not something that we would put off until September or October, that we would pull together this work and then maybe reconvene and maybe there be some writing over the summer and something really wrapped up in the fall. Does that seem like too long?
Can I make just an
Term of
amendment?
servitude?
I agree with everything Dick said. I mean, I think there were a couple constraints that we were thinking about when we were thinking about this, if it helps you all. I mean, one is that the summer is a very difficult time to have important conversations in this community. I think we learned that all last year with the B-Space process. People don't like leaving schools or town in June and then having big decisions come before them in September that they are unaware of, or worse, that there were public hearings or votes taken over the summer. They don't react well to that. So I think we're all learning that. We've learned that lesson. We want to take that lesson to heart. And I think for July and August, there might be some, as Dick said, drafting or something, but nothing substantive that would require community input or community notification about. So that leaves us with, can we wrap up everything by the end of June or not? And if not, I think that's the September timeframe that Dick was talking about. But I think that what's clear, unless Betsy and Ellen want to say something different, is that no later than at an absolute outside October 1st do these things have to go to the Board of Selectmen and to discuss override things, or to the school committee to discuss policy things, because there is an entire process after this committee is done. I'm seeing vigorous nodding of heads for those of you who are watching at home, that there's a substantial process that has to go on thereafter in terms of their own deliberations, their own hearings, their own structuring of overrides, their own policy deliberations about policy changes for the schools. I mean, there's a whole thing that has to happen. And so I guess part of the question that Dick and I were noodling on was, could we actually get there by the end of June? If we can't, then we kind of have a few weeks in September, maybe a hiatus and a few weeks in September. But if at all possible, the end of June was kind of what we were looking at. So I don't know if that gives a little bit more color, but I agree with what he said.
I mean, go ahead.
Lisa may well say, we're not going to have final capital numbers.
Right. No, I was going to say the opposite, actually. I mean, I guess I'm a little unclear as to what it is, additional information we're sort of waiting for. I mean, I thought that the committees were, driving to their reports, and we had gotten to recommendations. Now we need to put cost toward the recommendations, which I think everybody's aware of and is doing. And then we're going to come and share those numbers, and then we're going to debate where we stood on those numbers, which sort of goes to your momentum piece. And I guess it doesn't feel like that should take till June. So that's sort of the first point. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm missing something that we need that I'm not aware of. But then my other piece is that from the capital subcommittee's perspective, there are some things that we can achieve within what we know and within the bounds of this committee. And then there are some recommendations that we may or may not have for next steps.
Right.
And if we do that, time is really important to us. And that time is not time that we have. It means time that we conclude, we make our recommendations, and there is something else that happens. So in terms of this schedule, sort of my second question is how can we report that out, get that sort of moving, and it's in a fairly formal way? I mean, I think it would need some hearing, as it were. We're not there yet. I think our plan was to present to this group not on February 26th, but rather on March 2nd. Those are
Let me-
two separate questions.
So let
but-
me try to answer they are separate. So I think one is, I think we had heard that for many of the recommendations, that there were 46 things put out in the public hearing, that the very next step was kind of putting a dollar amount against those. So everyone's aligned on that. There was some question of, could the subcommittees prioritize within that and get it from 46 to a smaller number, fewer than 20 of the high potential recommendations? Maybe we can, maybe we can't. But that was sort of, once you saw the cost and you said, okay, here's how much the cost or savings is, here's how hard it is to implement, very simple, 2 by 2, somebody drew, and, could we get it at least in that range of priorities? Okay, so I think people felt more or less clear on that. I think what was the next piece, though, is to actually model out how you would combine some of these into a recommendation. And I think that's where people started getting a little bit less clear, because one person, I think there was one stream of discussion, I should say, was around, well, if we had a number to hit at, that would be a lot easier. If we knew we were trying to create a basket of things that was supposed to be a 6 or a 7, something that was supposed to be a 9, something that was supposed to be 11, that would be easy for us to try to aim at. Now, it would be complicated to put those portfolios together, put those little baskets together, but at least if we had that number, that would be helpful. I think another thing that we heard was, it's actually very hard for people to vote on one item without seeing, I'm seeing more vigorous head nodding, vote on one item without understanding what all the rest of the trade-offs were. So I think that so let me say it back this way and see if this gets at it, which is that if there are recommendations from the subcommittees that you feel, given that context, could or should be voted on in isolation, meaning it actually doesn't affect all of those moving parts that we've been talking about all along, then great, maybe we should do those. But to the extent that it really is going to be part of the soup, you should expect pushback from your committee members to say, we're not ready to take that vote.
Yeah, I would
is that fair?
personally, I would personally find it very difficult to look at it very piecemeal, and then you also get at you throw something up and all the darts are thrown at it, so what might have seemed simple becomes more difficult, but you are looking at trade-offs, and we don't have to do it all. And then the political comes in. So, yeah, I think I want to see all the pieces together, have less than 46 with solid numbers behind it, so that we can say, okay, here's the menu, and then hash out which ones we think are worth pursuing and which not.
Does that answer your question, Lisa? Or
That sort of answers actually my second question. My first question, I guess I would just say, I think that was clearer about the steps that we need to take to get there. I mean, I would like to just see a schedule that says we will be done on June 30th, and here is how that's going to work backwards. We're going to take, understanding that we may need
somebody
to.
want to put,
Melissa?
May on the somebody want to put May 31st on the table?
But
So
just
we're moving from September to June, which is just fine. But go ahead.
But, well, I mean, in terms of the, or where we think we need to be,
Right.
because I just feel like the momentum piece, and I also feel like we all need to understand the steps that we're taking to get there, and all on the same page. I mean, how you described it was clear, but what does that mean in terms of weeks and who does what during what time?
Related to this, I think, is the question of our final deliverable.
Right.
And ultimately, as you know, the formal decision of what's put on the ballot in the form of an override is the decision of the Board of Selectmen. They would do that in consultation with the school committee based on recommendations that this committee might make to them. And I think one question is how we might ultimately structure our report in order to be most useful in that process. And the problem is that there are so many moving pieces. We have potential policy changes, we have potential savings, we have potential revenue sources, we have tax revenue sources, we have non-tax revenue sources. And we can get to packages mixing and matching all of those elements. And I must say that I'm not clear as to what the best way is to go about it. I mean, one way is to say, well, let's look at we saw an 11% override plus the regular increase, which would be 14%. So that's kind of the high end, and okay, let's pick 11%, 8%, 5%, to, use numbers that I've seen, I think, or, 4, 6, 9, whatever percent. And then say, how could we get to those? Another way to do it is I think to look at the way that this was originally presented to this committee with the structural deficit, keeping things as they are, then the catch-ups and enhancements and technology, and making some policy decisions within those, or policy recommendations within those, and then building from that point, as opposed to building from a target number, target percent that we'd get to in various and sundry ways. But ultimately, we're not going to be making this decision. But the question is, how do we best structure this? Do people have thoughts about how we best structure this? I know that the chairs of the boards are here for this discussion. I don't have great ideas, but I would love to, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Betsy, can you come to the microphone? Just. Sorry.
I just, and this is a sort of an aside, but it has to do with decision-making process. I was looking at information to do with the 2008 override. And I can tell you that there were policy recommendations. One in particular was sale of taxi medallions. Guess what? We haven't done it yet. There were other ones that have not been implemented. So you need to be very, very careful about how you mix and match actual dollar implications with recommendations that may or may not get implemented. And that's very important for when we actually do an override campaign, all right? We cannot go to the public. I can't go to the public and say the following XYZ savings or whatever can be accomplished if it has not already been implemented. So taxi medallions were pie in the sky. Actually, we may do taxi medallions by the end of this current year, which is 6 years after the override vote. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I think it's really important for those of us who will be ultimately taking something to the voters to be careful about how a recommendation can be implemented and have actual financial budgetary impact. There are a lot of other things that I could say, and I guess for me personally, what I would love is to see variables and how the variables impact on, and maybe the scenarios that Dick mentioned, which could be an override of a certain dollar amount whose value is what percentage increase over the existing, So it may be incremental packages, but with components that it's really, from our perspective, important to be able to explain in fairly straightforward, simple language to people who are going to be the decision makers, who are actually going to be the voters who go to the polls on the override. So as fascinating as your earlier discussion about the numbers that went into the calculation, that has no place in a discussion about an override. You've got to be able to come up with something that we, or whoever it is who has to explain it, can do it in lay people's terms that are understandable. And I guess what I'm trying to say about that is that from the policy perspective, it's really very difficult for me to go to a voter and say XYZ policy change will take place, because I can't make that promise. In fact, I can tell you right now categorically, I will not make that promise. What I will say is these are the dollar values, And these are the ways that we can possibly supplement revenues. But I can almost guarantee you that between now and the time the voters go to the polls, very little of that will have been implemented. And so that's a promise that I personally am not even clear I'd be willing to make. You have to think about that. It's the uncertainty factor that's very important here. Sorry.
Since we have Betsy here, any questions?
Thoughts, comments?
So when policy recommendations are made, if I'm hearing you correctly, then the cost can be calculated, but because that policy hasn't been implemented, you can't actually do it. So even for something like the GIC, let me just use an example, like the GIC was recommended and was subsequently implemented, but the cost of the GIC. The savings, sorry, I meant, so the savings associated with the GIC, the group said, we think that you all should go into the GIC, and here's the savings range that you could get if you did it, but that number is not figured into the override number. So that's where you're saying that they're both important conversations, but they're not actually, there's not a linear relationship. Okay, does that resonate for people? Okay, thank you.
Just to make sure that I'm understanding this, if we talked before about sort of the all-in number being an 11% override, and then we thought, well, okay, we should look at other numbers that were not quite so challenging, perhaps. But I think if you think of, sort of 11, 8, and 5, for example, as the numbers that, someone threw out, my sense is that the only way you get to 5 working is with substantial policy changes that reduce costs going forward. And if policy changes are essentially off the table for what we can do or what is relevant to our work, then is there much for us to do other than to say 11%?
Well, I think there's another way to look at it.
Yeah.
It's that you would say the all-in number, the high number, is 11%. Everything goes forward the way it does, but even that we'd have to tweak because that isn't a really great number for future growth and what we know might happen. Then we could say, if these policies were implemented, then we think we could reduce the target to this percent. If these policies were fully implemented, we might get it down to this percent. So you're having the discussion, you're quantifying what you think will happen, but you're recognizing it ain't there. And Bessie, does that make it easier to deal with the voters so that they see a range of options that are dependent on different things?
Yeah, I think that does. And I guess what I was trying to say in part is that it's the timing. If there is a policy, the truth is at the time we did the override, the GIC was already kind of rolling forward. We knew about it and we were prepared to go ahead with it. We didn't know exactly what the savings would be and we certainly hadn't implemented it. But there are other things that might take far more time. And so to the extent that there are policy decisions which could be endorsed but not fully implemented, that makes it
That happens with people.
We're done. Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, that kind of guidance would be very helpful. If there, and I use the taxi medallions as an example because the reality is there's a substantial, potentially at least, there's a substantial amount of money engaged with taxi medallions, even if it's one-time funds. So there are obviously going to be some things that would be quicker and easier. And there are other things that are much more long-range and perhaps much more questionable in terms of whether they can be implemented. So those are the kinds of things that would be of great concern.
Go ahead, Lee.
Let me see if I can at least propose a sort of a concrete example, and maybe Betsy can respond to this. One of the things we've been talking about is the potential for reducing the expansion requirements by increasing class size. So supposing that, just for the sake of discussion, we would have determined that if you increase class size by an average of 1 or 1.5, kids per class, we could avoid, let's say, 10 classrooms by 2015, by 2019 or 2020. Now, that's going to materially affect the amount of the debt exclusion, potentially amount of the override. Obviously, this committee is not in a position to adopt that policy, and it's up to the school committee to make that judgment. What I'm trying to understand from what you've said is that something we are we able to even do that? Are we able to say, listen, if we can increase class size, the override can be X percent instead?
I think it's exactly what Janet said, which is that the top line, the full number is this. Here's a number of policy change recommendations that we're making. If you actually proceed with those recommendations, here are the savings or the changes that would incur to that top line number, and that's how you would describe it.
But from a process standpoint, what that of course means is what? That the school committee in that example, in my example, would have to make that determination before this gets on the ballot? Is there only one number going to go on the ballot? How do the voters weigh in on that choice, or don't they have an opportunity to weigh in on that choice?
Can I respond to that? Thanks, Lee. Okay. Yes, green is better than red. Yeah. So it has to do with the timing of the recommendations, because surely if you recommend a policy change that has to do with the school committee jurisdiction, we would need some time in the fall to discuss that. That would be a decision that we would need to make or not make, which would affect then what the override amount might be. So from a process point of view, it is something that the school committee should have an opportunity to address based on the discussion that you've had here in the fall, probably earlier rather than later.
Kevin?
To clarify that, so what you're saying effectively is that the school committee would confront that policy choice, adopt a position on it, and whatever the position was would then be simply ratified or rejected by the voters. In other words, the voters don't get to vote on the policy change. They simply get to vote on whether they agree or disagree with what you did.
Well, the selectmen structure the override, not the school committee. So just so we're clear, so the selectmen structure what goes on the ballot and why. The school committee makes its policies. At the end of the day, the school committee gets an appropriation number based on whatever various groups in town think, and then the school committee decides how to allocate that appropriation number. And the only way to affect that is for 1 year to actually structure into an override. You need to spend this money on elementary world language for a year. But what the school committee gets is an appropriation number, and they have the policy jurisdiction, regardless of whether it's the fall or after the fall, to do anything with it. I think what Betsy's comment was, which was very helpful, was to say, the full top line would be X, and here are the implications of different policy recommendations. I think the question for us is, to what extent are we going to try to vote as a group on what those policy recommendations should be to the selectmen?
Kevin?
Can I suggest that a lot of this will become clear as we talk to each other more? I mean, going back to the 93, 94 recommendations, there were some that as a group we were just absolutely clear on. We didn't have the power to force anybody to do it, but we said to the school committee, you need to have contingency funds in your budget and not rely solely on the reserve fund. And the school committee was able to respond with those changes. There were other financial policy recommendations that were made that were adopted by the Board of Selectmen before the override vote, and those were all things in which there was unanimity from the committee. Right? There were other recommendations which were more along the lines that Betsy was talking about, which would say you need to hold the line on collective bargaining at 2%, because with the amount of money that you're going to be able to get out of the override, if you don't, you're going to be back in trouble. And in fact, everyone was aware that was the recommendation of the equivalent of this committee. The selectmen said, we're going to do our best, but they couldn't commit to actually doing it. In the end, they couldn't. And that put additional pressures on the budget that had to be responded to. Then there are also things where there's not going to be agreement in this group, right? And we are going to put forward alternatives. So, the majority in 94 suggested an override of a certain amount, including building additional capital into the operating budget. A minority suggested 3 annual capital exclusions, one-time payments of capital. Again, that went to the selectmen. They decided on a smaller override than the majority recommended, but building all the capital in it. And the last time around, there were sort of 4 levels of override that seemed to be relevant. There was a clear consensus on 2 levels, less of a consensus on a third, and less of a consensus on the 4th. Do the voters get to decide? That was up to the selectmen to decide what they got to decide about. And the selectmen went forward with the 3 together. They did not give the option of only 2. They decided on 3, or 3 plus the 4th, right? And there are a variety of ways that the selectmen can structure the override. And I think as we talk among ourselves, what the reasonable options are will become apparent. And we may have a majority and a minority report. We may have 3 levels. We may have a whole menu. But I think it's too early for us to try to say how we are going to structure this. We have to talk to each other a whole lot more to know where we're going.
I think that does get to, Lisa, your point of why can't we just finish, which many of us feel. But I think, I know. Right, but I think it is some of this, how do we combine the baskets in different ways? And I guess I don't think that anybody is under any illusions that we're going to have unanimous votes on things like policy thoughts, but I would hope that we are unanimous on the fact base. I would be very disappointed in us if we can't get an agreement on what the facts are. So even the first hour of this meeting, I thought you can get there with different methodologies, but if we can agree on 15 to 17 as a practical range for everyone to work from, that actually is our mandate. We can't not agree on the fact base. And if we don't agree on the fact base, we have to be absolutely transparent and crystal clear about what the assumptions are or why they're different, because that is something we have to do. And the policy thing, we might not get consensus on, and it seems a different question.
So I'm sorry, Chad, go ahead.
So I just want to start, I want to revisit the statistics debate between, no, I'm just kidding.
Here's my pea shooter.
Further thought.
Clearly Chad wants to stay here till December.
Yeah.
Remember, there's no pizza tonight.
I know, I wanted to see if I could make anybody's head actually explode.
These meetings will go a lot shorter if Dick doesn't buy us pizza every time.
So, but in terms of timing then, if we're thinking about sort of what it is that we're trying to do, it seems like if there's from when we come out with a set of recommendations, there's a large chunk of work that has to be done pre-override for any sort of policy recommendations to be of any use at all.
Correct.
It seems to me that we should try to be somewhat aggressive about a target date for a core list of recommendations on policy. And I don't know what aggressive actually translates out to, but trying to give that window so that we can say, okay, here's the analysis of what the numbers are, but also we would say here's the 10 policies that we most strongly recommend changing or that have the biggest impact, and you decide you decide the values, you're the elected officials. But to make sure that we're giving that time. And I worry that if we say, okay, well, we're going to meet until June, and then we'll have a hiatus, and then we'll get back and have some hearings in the fall, and then we're going to hand it off to the selectmen, and they're going to be like, okay, we got to turn this thing around. Can't do anything with the policies, set them over here. So
You're getting nodding heads from your chairs back there.
I like that. I like nodding heads.
The only thing I would say, here's the only thing I would say.
Go on. Going to sleep.
The only thing I would
joke
say-
was supposed to keep them awake.
Again, my only small, I love everything you said, except my only small caveat is bringing it back to the conversation we had earlier of people saying we can't vote for these in isolation. So I think that the core list of our short list and the dollars associated with it, I actually feel like this committee can get there in a decently rapid amount of time, not hugely rapid given the school's budget thing, but decently rapid. I think it's more that next piece of what Kevin was talking about was how do you combine these? What are the actual trade-offs if we're asking people to vote because people are not interested in voting in isolation? It's that piece of work, and can that get compressed into the May-June timeframe?
Fair enough. But I mean, I think we've gone, we all recognize that March 1st was not realistic. But when we talk, June, we're now talking all of March, all of April, all of May, that multiple months of time. So I'm strongly in the camp of we need to talk. I agree that we need to have a holistic recommendation where we understand, okay, this is what we're recommending. At the same time, I think, it's probably not appropriate for us to say, here's the exact basket you should do. Some of what we're going to be doing is saying, here are the policy implications of a number of different, or the financial implications of a number of different policy changes. Here's the core perhaps that we recommend, but ultimately it's up to the selectmen in consultation with the school committee to decide that policy. I mean, they're elected, so.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, to take Lee's example of class size, if class size would save X dollars, and if a small increase in class size would save X dollars, and I think one of two things might happen. The schools, by the time of the override vote, would have said, yes, we've done it, and the vote would be a lower amount, or they would say, well, we haven't gotten to it yet, and then it would be a question of what the selectmen put on the ballot. Do they put a smaller amount or a higher amount on the ballot? If they put a higher amount on the ballot, the voters could say, I'm not going to vote for it. Or they could put a lower amount on the ballot, and essentially that would be, the assumption would be that policy change would be implemented.
Or some other one.
Or some other revenues found or something. Yeah.
Or some other policy change taken to get a similar savings.
Yeah. So, ultimately, you're right. I mean, we're not going to make that determination, but I do think that the work that this committee has done and is doing will inform not only the people who are making those decisions, but ultimately the voters who are going to have to decide whether what they've been presented with is reasonable and what they want to support.
So Dick or Betsy, is it fair to say that if the selectmen were to, as you said, put a lower number on that assumes a policy change anywhere, it doesn't have to be schools, assumes any policy change that is not currently in effect, that it would need a fairly strong statement from this committee that that is the way to go to reduce that appropriation in the absence of having that policy change be actually in effect, if they're willing to do it at all? I'm trying to play out that scenario. The scenario that says, pick a policy change. This policy change would have X million dollars of impact, and it's not going to be implemented, but we're going to assume it is going to be implemented, and we're therefore going to put a lower number on the ballot, assuming it's implemented, and those savings can be realized.
That may be an unanswerable question.
Well, I guess the question is that would you then, in order to do that, would you need just the number from this Override Study Committee, or would you need a strong statement from the Override Study Committee saying this is really, really important to do?
I think that would help us. And I guess it's, obviously, everybody here understands how complicated things are. But in terms of having something that could be realistically enacted and have an impact, if not in the fiscal year of the vote, but a subsequent fiscal year, I would say maybe a sort of fair time frame, then we would need to have the appropriate entity, and if you want to talk about class size, then obviously the school committee would have to indicate willingness to change class size. If school committee says not, then I can't tell you what the Board of Selectmen would do. I can tell you that, and Kevin mentioned this, what we've done previously is we've provided what's called a pyramid or a tiered system on the ballot. And we can give people options. We could offer and I'm just being very hypothetical here, we could say, here's the override with no change in class size, here's the override with a change in class size. To do that without the support of the school committee for a change in class size, it seems to me politically is very risky. But that would be the kind of option that might exist. So I'm really not clear about how the various components have been discussed with your various subcommittees. So I feel kind of ignorant about that. But my argument was, or what I'm trying to say is that the work here is of critical significance to those of us who will be needing to make those decisions. And being able to quantify things is very, very important. And then the next thing is, all right, we've got the data components, we've got the variables. These are perhaps combinations that get us to a certain override number. Some of them may be combinations that are more palatable and implementable, and some of them may not be. And I think what we're looking for is the information that will help us evaluate those components and figure out, in the end, it's a political decision, what we can take to the voters. So in the end, don't forget, it's not the Board of Selectmen or the school committee, it's going to be the folks who go to the voting booth at the time of the override. So what is important for us is to have a clear message about what it is we're asking the voters to do and why. And sometimes you have to simplify things to do that.
Okay, have we confused this enough?
So I think back to the question of a structure for the next few months, I think that one thing that would be helpful, and we don't have to do it tonight, but it would be helpful before the break, is to kind of hear from each of the subcommittees. So I guess what would be helpful is to hear from each of the subcommittees to say, what do each of you believe is the aggressive but not insanely fast time frame to wrap up your pieces along the trajectory we just laid out. Dick and I can pull that together. I mean, we can't tell you how fast to go, but we can say, all right, given where these 8 committees are, here's roughly the time when we think we can have the report out on 46 line items and the dollars associated. Here's roughly when we think we can have that top priority list, that short list, if you will, identified. And then here's roughly when we think we could start combining them in various ways to do that. I mean, I think the one piece that will take time is what we're going to be doing, what we did last time, what we're going to do tonight is almost these deep dives in the various areas so that everybody can get up to speed before being asked to vote on, do we think this is a good fiscal policy change or not? Do we think this is a good school policy change or not? I mean, I'm clear that people really want a lot more information, so, yeah.
So Betsy and I were just talking and recalling that in the last override campaign, at the beginning of the campaign, we actually did some surveys, which turned out to be helpful. And so that takes some time as well. And so your potential time frame of either the beginning of the summer or in the early fall would probably, if the people involved in the campaign after the Board of Selectmen had either before or after they made their decisions might be possible.
Sure.
Actually, this is beginning to make a little bit more sense to me.
Uh-huh.
Yes. When you talk about the campaign, that is very different. The campaign, which will be determined by the Board of Selectmen in consultation with the school committee, with the input from our committee, which will give a variety of ways, efficiencies that we've been talking about. Their job, I guess what I'm trying to say is that our job as the override committee what we're going to present to the Board of Selectmen is different in my brain than what the ultimate campaign will look like.
Correct.
The campaign is, and I don't want to confuse, for me, I don't want to confuse that because I think that it's possible by the end of June, it seems to me, that we could come out with a product that would, in fact, have the summary of all of our subcommittees and get some consensus on that. And then in September, October is when the work happens with the Board of Selectmen and with the school committee as to where do we go from here. So this is actually, I think it's
So I'm 99% agree. I think there's still the piece of work in the middle where we come up with our long list and the dollar amounts, we come up with our short list and the dollar amounts. We still need to do some work to combine those in different ways, and we can figure out how far we want to go on that. But this is essentially a fact-finding, independent body that provides information as input to the Board of Selectmen, who ultimately structure the override. We don't structure the override, but we do provide that fact base. What isn't helpful, if I understand you correctly, is here are 20 different line items with a bunch of costs and revenues associated with it. You put it together, good luck. I think what you, correct me if I'm wrong, if that's all you want, we could be done in a couple weeks. But it's my understanding that what you are asking for is how those things might play out together, what packages or how they might play out together. Okay. But it's completely decoupled from the campaign. You're absolutely right about that.
So let's get back to, I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble. So if we're going to put together packages, packages that come up with what? Because, 11% is an easy package to come up with, right? So the question is, what are the other packages that you're trying to create? What are you shooting for?
I think that you're putting the cart before the horse. I think that we have to see, I have never built a budget to reach a number, and I always have told people, don't worry about that because you won't think hard enough if you start with where you're going to end. So I think what we've been doing in the committees is saying this is the range of things to look at. We came up with a very long list. We're now going to get that shorter with some numbers on it and then see what that comes to and as a group reach consensus. If the group comes to the point of saying we can't agree on any of these, we're going to turn around and say, good luck, you're going to have to pass an 11% override because we don't see a way of giving you any further guidance. But I think if we say we're looking for 8% or 5%, I think that we're not going to think as thoroughly as we otherwise would.
So what you're suggesting is that we go through all these different efficiencies, revenue opportunities, policy cuts, determine how much we can raise or how much we can cut, and then the override is what's left?
No.
Can I suggest, I really think that if we talk to each other about the subcommittees
We'll see
in
what
more
we want.
detail, this will get a whole lot easier. And doing it in the abstract is really hard.
Yeah, I agree.
The only other thing, area, is that prior to today's session, we were always operating at this FY15 recommendation. So now that we're going to pass FY15, do we have any guidance on how much further we should look at when we project revenues, expenses?
That's the question of are we looking at 3 years or 5 years and how quickly we think we're going to need another override because revenues are not growing as fast as expenses no matter what we do.
I guess some of this has to do with how certain, and I don't know if there's an abstract answer to that question. I think part of what I was hearing in 5-6 meetings ago when we talked about this was we think 3 years is a tractable number. We can have enough of certainty and visibility into it that we feel like that could be a real thing. We think 5 years is a little, 7, I think the number at the time was 7 years is way too long, even though some of these capital decisions take a lot longer to play out, even though some of these policy implications, as Lee's pointed out, take longer to play out to get their full effect. we could do a pro forma that long, but we don't have enough certainty about the budget 7 years from now to be able to say, here is a really good 7-year budget. Even the CIP doesn't do that. So I think the 3 to 5 year range, and then people started feeling squeamish about 5, so we got back to 3. Replaying the conversation, it was how certain do we think we can be, recognizing that we are going to have to, in the final report, create long-term capital projections, long-term, to Lee's point, there are policy, lifetime policy implications, that those numbers have to be part of this also. But I think that's a little bit decoupled from the how many years of how much clarity can we have.
Also, from a capital perspective, we're looking at the B space number was based on 5 years out, right? So the capital recommendation necessarily has to take a view that extends well beyond a single fiscal year.
I meant to just say that, so I'm sorry if I didn't. I agree, 100%.
It is conceivable, I suppose, that you could have an operating override large enough to cover anticipated structural deficits and expansion for 3 years, I think it would have to be fair to the voters, with notice to the voters that there might be another one in 3 years, and a debt exclusion that covered a longer period. So.
And that's a choice of the selectmen in a sense. That's absolutely right.
Can I just go back to Cliff's comment for a moment? Because I think I have a mental model in my brain of how this can work that might be helpful to people. So I think there's basically 3 buckets of things that 3 buckets of recommendations that we would want to put things in. One is longer term issues which aren't going to affect our override number, but we want to flag them for our decision makers.
The taxing medallions.
Right. The second is a bucket of recommendations that they might want to consider but are much harder to implement, like either because there's not political will or what have you. And then there's a bucket of recommendations that, again, could go into the override number but may be easier to implement. And then from there, I think we end up with 3 scenarios. I think we have our full package. We have scenario 2, which cuts out the things that we think are easier to implement. We have scenario 3, which cuts out all the things that could be implemented in a reasonable time frame, even the ones that have harder political will. And then again, that first bucket of longer term, that doesn't go into our numbers. So 3 scenarios, and that's how we build it up. So it isn't necessarily that we're targeting 11%, 8%, 5%, but that's how we get to our 3 scenarios. Does that make sense?
Anybody just, Lee, were you going to say something? I'm sorry, I thought you looked like you were going to say something.
Well, I was still curious about the statistical debate.
Let it go. Okay.
My one comment with in that the sort of the long-term thing, I think the focus of that should be on the potential for avoiding or needing a future override. So it's not just an abstract, doesn't go into our numbers. It certainly doesn't go into any numbers we're going to come up with in the near term.
Right.
But I think that it should be focused on the issue of the next override or lack thereof.
I agree.
Right, and I think the only thing I would add to that is that there are a couple of things here which you would essentially say to the voters, there are things we don't know. We don't know, for example, all of the capital costs going out, and we're not going to know it by May of 15, right? There are going to be capital costs that every 6 months you're going to get better capital information. Every 6 months you're going to get better enrollment information. We will have more information about Hancock Village. Like, there are going to be a whole lot of more pieces of information that you won't have at the time of the override. So I think our role about establishing the fact base and just being very transparent about here's what we know, here are the big things that we don't know that we will learn over time that will influence that number over time, I think will be helpful, because there's no point in time at which we will know everything about the high school, about Hancock Village, about whatever else is coming online. So just that transparency, I think, is going to be important whatever point we pick as the stopping point.
At some point, maybe not. I'll use my, I think they're yours. Okay. Somehow we have to decouple, communicate, change the image a little of this committee, get ahead, because there is an image in the public, in the news, whatever, certainly from the emails we get, that what we're going to recommend is going to be very tied to B-Space. And what I hear, and I'm other people hear, that it is this committee's job to find the money to fund B-Space. And phrases like, the train's already left the station on that one, and, this is not, that feeds into that. And when you see the room filled with Driscoll people, or people feeling the decisions were made during the summer, I think those are the decisions they're talking about. So the demographic committee, while we think of ourselves as George Marshall, and we're making long-term solid plans that will help the town predict and have a sense of what trends are, and that this will be a good 5 or 10-year plan. Demographics committee, we're talking about what will 2020 look like. We recognize that we're talking to Alan Morse as Eisenhower and Betsy DeWitt as George Patton, and that piece is going forward, and whether it's our language or how and I think as the reports come out in June, that's going to be a very important time in terms of the publicity, in terms of how the public sees the committee. And if we aren't talking about it soon and continually, we'll lose the credibility of the committee on some of the more important pieces that we want to put forward. I don't know if anyone's heard that kind of feeling around town. I'm sure most or all of you have.
So somewhere in this idea of scenarios, packages, either a full package, something that's easier, something that's harder, whatever it is, that we will learn a lot more as we go. I think there seems to be at least a center of gravity there. I won't say it's consensus, but a center of gravity that's something to point at. But I think what we need is the reports from the subcommittees as to how close you are to getting to that list of items and dollar amounts.
And I think, I completely agree with Betsy. I think that factual information is going to be the key first step. And whether it's packages, not packages, I don't know at this point, and I don't think any of us do. And but I do think that what I am hearing is that the individuals who are going to have to make these decisions ultimately would like to see options in one form or another.
Okay, good. I think the other thing that I'm hearing, just to pick up on something we talked about last time, was that people do feel like if they are going to be asked to vote, people in this committee feel like if they're going to be asked to vote on important policy recommendations or changes, either individually or as groups, that not only do we need more discussion time here, but that another public hearing of this group would be important. We heard that around the last public hearing where people said, well, that was great, but we didn't really have dollar amounts traded off, and it was very hard to vote based on that. So I think that was the other thing I heard, which was if this group decides that it wants to vote on specific policy changes to go into this or to go to the selectmen, then a public hearing would be involved. If it doesn't want to do that, if it just wants to say, here's stuff you could do, we might not need another public hearing for this group. Okay.
Fair enough on that? You want to get back to some topic on this, Chad?
No, I think we've covered it.
Okay. Community Preservation Act, Revenue Subcommittee.
Melissa, can I
Say transfer.
use the overhead?
So Chad, do you like standing up, or you just don't learn very fast?
Well, I got here late. I was going to take a different seat. And then,
this point, everybody is tired and hungry, and if we keep, that's why we should get. The question of how soon we'll be done depends on how many more times it's going to snow and keep us meeting, because we're supposed to meet tomorrow. And I said to Cliff when I came in, do you think we're going to make it?
While we're waiting, I just want to say thank you so much to Betsy for joining us at our meeting and giving us that clarity. It's lovely to have you. Thank you, Alan, for coming.
As a point of process, I think we should refer to Betsy as general.
General Patton.
And I'm gonna add that to the warrant for town meeting.
Whatever helps.
I was
Be it
just wondering
resolved.
where the Catholic nuns were going to come in, too.
Be it resolved that all future, now does this attach to the chair of the Board of Selectmen or to Betsy as a person? This new moniker of General
I think
Patton?
this attaches to Betsy as a person. I think when she leaves the office, it remains.
Her honorific?
remains
Okay.
Exactly.
Actually going to snap.
So the Revenue Subcommittee would like to address to the entire Override Study Committee two topics that require a little bit deep dive so that we can pursue these as recommendations to the Board of Selectmen for them to consider to pursue. And these would have implications later, not direct implications that we will see immediately. I've distributed in advance PowerPoint and 2 Word documents for you guys to do some homework, as they put it. So we're here. I forgot to dress in purple, but Kevin and Team Purple. Kevin and Beth and I are here to answer any questions that you might have. So let's start with any questions for the Community Preservation Act.
Do you want to?
You want me? I didn't want to go through it because it just would take some time.
So I guess, at this point, when are you proposing that it go forward? We missed this year, is that correct? No,
Not
we
yet,
did
if we
not.
move quickly.
Right.
And you're still thinking of doing it for this year?
My personal view would be you either do it this year or you don't, because I don't think you're going to put a CPA on the ballot at the same time you put an override on.
And my question would be, if you put it on a ballot now, people know an override is coming, how they react to that.
I agree.
But, because my question, if I saw it on the ballot, is, okay, so if I vote for this, which is going to raise my taxes by 1.5%, I think you're using, does that mean that instead of an 11% override, you're talking about, don't ask me to do math in my head, 9.5% override? And if not, how am I supposed to afford it all?
So I'm happy to answer. I mean, I think that is the idea, is that I don't think any of us think we're going to get away with less than a 2% tax increase, right? If we can get roughly 2% with 4.4% of it coming from the state, so it's only 1.6%, right? That's an advantage. But I think you also raised the very important political question. Can you explain that to people? Can you say, we're going with this proposal, which isn't obvious in an obvious way addressing those questions, in order to get the state match and to reduce the amount of the tax override that we need, right? Or do people just get confused and say, you're coming with an override later, why are you bothering me with the Community Preservation Act?
I may be being optimistic, but I would almost think it would be easier to do them together, because then you could say, all right, we did the analysis and we came up with, we need an 8% tax increase. However, we can get a 7.6% tax increase by structuring it as part override, part CPA, and so we're recommending that we do that. We're going to have a 6% override, a 1.6% CPA, whatever it works out to be, and that, because of state funding that comes in, allows us to reach the 8% by only paying 7.6% ourselves. I get that it's a little bit arcane, but I think I think the basic pitch is pretty straightforward.
Chad, the only thing that I'm sure Beth was going to say is that you're foregoing 600,000 every year, or whatever that state match would be.
Sorry, I don't understand.
You miss 1 year.
Right,
One year.
right,
No,
so
but
you miss, you forego $600,000
I'm
of
not,
state match.
I'm not saying don't do it this year.
For 1 year.
I'm not saying don't do it this year. I'm simply addressing the point of you don't put them on the ballot at the same time. I would argue, in fact, I would rather put it on the ballot at the same time than to say, okay, we have this undefined override that's coming, and let's take a chunky tax increase now, because I think that's actually much harder to sell. That's a separate question from if we should do it, we should try to do it now for separate reasons maybe, but just to that one point.
I think that I would agree that it would be more saleable as part of an integrated package rather than something that was on the ballot with an override, a known override, but an override of uncertain dimension coming down the pike. And I think it actually might be easier to explain as part of an integrated package by being able to say, look, we were able to reduce the other part by X by using this, if that's ultimately the decision. So, and I'm not going to speak for my fellow selectmen, but there is some experience that this town has had with the CPA being on the ballot with a known override coming down the pike later, and it lost, in part because I think the schools who were going to be proponents of the second override were concerned about the CPA passing. And I don't know whether one could make the argument that this is really all for the benefit of the community as a whole as easily if they were on ballots at different times as you could if they were on the ballot at the same time. That's just my personal feeling.
I don't claim to have a crystal ball. I'll make two comments. I mean, I certainly see Chad's point. One, in terms of the history, I mean, we were going for at that time, for the CPA, which would have increased spending on CPA items as opposed to merely supplanting it, right?
Right.
So that was the view that we were increasing taxes more than necessary when we were going to need those funds for the schools, ask the taxpayers to pay for that. Certainly did undermine that campaign. I think this would be different. I think the real question is, unfortunately, of course, we can't say we would have given you 8%. Now we're giving you 6% and 1.6%. But we don't get the opportunity to say, but you have to vote for both or neither. And there is the concern, the reason my gut instinct was not to put them on the ballot at the same time, is there is the concern that some people will say, I'm fine with the 1.6, but I won't vote for the 6. And some people will say, I'm fine for the 6, but I won't vote for the 1.6. When you might have got a majority for something that was larger than either of the two separately. That might be wrong, but that was my concern, because in some sense they compete with each other if they're on the ballot at the same time. But I also recognize Chad's point that maybe they compete with each other just as much if they're on in separate years, in which case his political judgment is correct.
I think the other thing I would add to that is that if we have an override recommendation, we can say, here's the need. If we were just doing a straight override, it would be 8, and instead it's going to be 6 and 1.6. If they're separated, then we're making the more nebulous suggestion that there is an X% override coming, and by giving a 1.6% CPA, we can reduce that by 2 percentage points, but we can't tell you what X is yet. And I think a lot of voters would look at that and say, yeah, X isn't going to be 2 percentage points lower, we're just going to have the CPA and then we're going to have a big override, or at least it'll feel that way, so.
You've also got people who are largely uninformed. I deal with a lot of, I mean, that's my building of folks that's, who know about the override because I'm on this committee. And so to the extent that they've just heard there's something out there, they might confuse the 1.6 with it and say, oh, they said it was going to be big, this is it, and then be totally shocked next year because most people aren't as, don't keep themselves as informed as you have over the years. I have another question about the proposal, which is also, you mentioned somewhere in there the syncing of the CIP with the needs of this is not perfect. So one of my questions when I read it was also, are you suddenly prioritizing things that if you have to make choices, which we know we're going to have to make, you could push further out? Do we really need to do that park now? Is it something that I now have to do in order to use this money? And that one bothered me, I think, a little bit more even than the timing of the.
Yeah, you certainly don't have to pull anything forward, right, because you can bank the money. Not clear whether you can bank some portion of it in an undefined area. That we need advice from town council, but you can certainly say, we're banking X dollars for open space until we have the need. The tricky part you know, if we decided that this was worth moving forward on, I would think we would want to ask Sean, okay, imagine now that this passed, tell us what the CIP would look like so that we could actually get the 2% each year. Because the big problem is actually the first year, where we've already committed to spending the money and we therefore can't use the CPA. After that, pretty much every year, I think we'll have no trouble. But I think that would be a really important thing to, if we decide it's worth going forward, to have Sean do.
Janet, thank you for your question. I would like to, I know that there's the whole timing issue. I would also like to answer any more of other questions to better inform you about the CPA. Are there any other questions you might have? Kevin can answer.
I had the exact same reaction as Janet about just the perception of pulling up priorities or, you know, creating new projects that need to be done. I think, you know, I think these are all worthwhile projects. I just think the perception of that, we're just going to need to deal with that.
Yeah, no, I really want to, I mean, I hope people have read it. I hope you read it again. You know, I don't know if I want you to throw rocks at me, but at least hard pillows. You know, it's really important that people bang on this and see if it makes sense and whether the things are missing.
You need a mic.
I think, you know, I think from a policy perspective, if we weren't dealing with the other issues that we're obviously here to deal with, I think it makes a ton of sense, and I think that's evidenced by the number of communities that are doing it or successfully doing it. So, I mean, I know what it is. I've read your materials, and I feel like it's something worth pursuing. I think the timing is an issue, and then I just think being sure that I think people will be more sensitive to the topic of prioritizing things you otherwise wouldn't have prioritized in this climate than they would have been, you know, in a different time for the town. So I just think we need to be confident about that, and maybe we need to have that conversation with Sean about what the CIP looks like before we even can go to a full vote on this one.
Kevin, why has Brookline not participated in this heretofore?
So there were, Dick, you helped me on this, but I think the first time around, there was a lot of concern about the process by which the funds get allocated. So there is a 9-person committee, 5 of whom are sort of statutorily determined, and 4 would be part of the vote. right? And so, my suggestion would be that it would be 2 selectmen, a school committee member, and an advisory committee member. But those are the ones who make the recommendation to town meeting. And unlike other things where town meeting can then do whatever it wants, town meeting can only vote it up or down, right? And so it doesn't have the flexibility. So I think there was a concern that without a clear statement beforehand as to how the money would be spent, that this committee could run amok. I'm less concerned about that, but it's still a concern. The second time around, we went for 3% instead of 1.5%. I think that was a huge political mistake. I think it was largely my political mistake. I thought, as we were developing this, that if we only went for the roughly 1.5%, which would cover the things that were already in the budget, that we would not get the support that we needed from the advocacy groups if they were getting nothing out of it. There were people like Carla here who argued very strongly we should just go for the 1.5%. I think if we'd done that, we would have won, but I don't know that. But those I think, Dick, do you agree with that political analysis?
I argued for the 1.5% as well,
Right.
and I think. Yeah, I think that the 3% was a tax increase, and a 1.5% would not have been a tax increase in people's minds, or could have been sold as a tax savings, something that would displace funds that would otherwise have to be raised by taxes. And that was particularly true back then because the reimbursement amount was much higher than it is now. And then there also was the impending school override, which was another factor that came into play. And I think you did not have the support of the school committee, of the school community, or many members of the school committee at that time.
I thought there were some school people who were not opposed to it. I didn't realize that was unanimous.
It was certainly not unanimous.
Okay.
I was on the school committee at the time.
No, but he wasn't alone, if I recall.
No, I was not alone.
Okay, I think the schools committee community was split. Okay.
It was split.
Just
And
for historical
I think it was actually had a
accuracy.
majority of the committee in favor, but I think Dick's point is to the community. And I think the school community, which is often critical in passing these kinds of tax increases, whether it voted majority for or majority against, I don't know, but there weren't a whole lot of people in the school community who wanted to devote large parts of their lives to getting it passed.
And it has not been tried since then. So.
When was this?
2008? 2007, 6? The override was 08. It was 07.
Yeah, so it's 2007.
I think it was 07.
No, it's before then because it's before I started, so.
Oh. 06, then 06?
That's what I remember.
Okay.
I mean, it's possible it was 06 because the override study committee that led to the 08 override started in 07, so.
Is that okay, Melissa? General Patton? Are we need a name for Melissa, I think.
Omar Bradley.
Are there any other areas?
I actually have some comments on it that I'll just forward to you offline. I think some of this write-up might have come from earlier write-ups, and I think the law was subsequently changed in response to a case in Newton to broaden eligible projects to allow rehabilitation and renovation of recreational facilities, recreational uses. And that's not reflected in here, so I'll get those comments to you offline.
I think we need advice about how to proceed. I mean, basically, do we want to take the position that we don't want to do it this year, and we're thinking about it at the same time as an override next year, or are we thinking in terms of this year, in which case, we have to get a recommendation to the selectmen very soon, and what does the committee need to see?
Well, Kevin, before that, I would think that, do we think the CPA is a good idea? Do we have your support in general?
Yeah, I agree.
Yes.
I agree.
Just to kind of build a little bit on maybe what Janet said. Again, this is new to me. However, politically, just in terms of the person on the street, if I were presented with this now, I vote yes. And then I think took care of it. I took care of it, and then an override is going to come again, and it would be confusing. I think it may be exciting trying to fit these two things together in a way that, and to message it in a way that they complement each other, that we're talking about a schools override, and this is the community. We're all kind of in this together. I mean, I think that it could be an exciting marketing opportunity to put both of these together and have the voters understand it. And I don't think it's that complicated to understand. So I like the idea of, I think I like the idea of putting it along with what Chad was saying, figuring out a way to market it and message it together. And I worry about what Janet was saying about now, took care of that.
I think when we discussed this as a subcommittee, I didn't think, when the three of us met to discuss this, I think we didn't think it was possible to bundle it up, if you will, with the override. So we were thinking strategically, we might be better off to just get this taken care of and see whether it actually passes, because it will affect the override amount.
I make a proposal on how to treat this, is that we make a decision, yes or no, as to whether or not we recommend the concept in general. We lay out what we've heard as some of the political concerns, but I would rather not this committee make a judgment on what the right or wrong politics are when I don't think that we're most of us aren't in a position to really make a judgment on that, and that we leave the decision of timing to the selectmen.
Here.
But from a timing perspective, this needs to be one of those items that we separate out, because we want to move it sooner. So how would that work? And then my second question would be that if we were thinking of bundling it, what would that mean for your reporting out in order to get it on town meeting at a later time?
So taking Beth's suggestion that we punt it to the selectmen, which ultimately have to anyway, if they were to decide that they wanted it on the FY15 May election, I would have to go back and check the exact rules, but town meeting would have to vote to put it on the ballot late enough, which I assume in November. I guess if they voted in November, then the next regular town election would be May. So it could go to the fall town meeting, and then it would go to the fall town meeting, and then it would be voted in the May election.
We also,
So that would be with the override?
Assuming that town meeting voted to put it on the ballot.
But your timing, so I guess my question is your timing now that you're suggesting it be in 2016 instead of 2015?
No, I was suggesting 2015. I was suggesting that if
I'm sorry, I'm just jumping ahead, yeah.
You're a woman ahead of your time.
Right. Well, yeah. So under the assumption that what we want to do is say to the selectmen, this is a good idea, we're not the political people here to say when, we would still have to make that recommendation soon. But if they thought that first of all, if they thought it was a good idea themselves, And if they thought FY15 was better, then, in fact, for FY15, pretty much anybody could put it put it forward to town meeting, and town meeting would have to vote to put it on the May ballot.
I have a question and a comment and a question. My concern would be of combining it with the general override, is particularly if the override is structured in terms of a possible menu of choices. Adding this to that would just create more confusion. In other words, if we're already giving the voters 2 or 3 choices within the context of the override, now you put this on top of that becomes one additional choice, and I think it could be problematic. My question is, we also have an election, congressional election, and senatorial election this November. And is it possible for this to go on the November ballot? That could certainly come before town meeting in May, that is this May, and then be put on November. I don't know whether procedurally that's even allowed, but
Yes, no, it is allowed. The reason that the subcommittee didn't propose it is that it seems to have the same problem of not getting the match for this coming year, because it gets voted after the fiscal year. It has the problems that Chad referred to of, well, you're doing it, the CPA vote before you know what the override vote is going to be. And frankly, on what is an issue that mostly local voters vote on, when you're in the middle of a gubernatorial campaign, it's very hard to get your message out. But it's certainly possible. It's absolutely legally possible.
Can I ask a process question? If, before we're talking about making recommendations but having to have public meetings for them, why isn't it that we're not talking about having a public meeting before we come to any conclusions on this?
I mean, I guess my answer would be the selectmen are required to have a public hearing on it. And we're really only making a recommendation to them, given timing.
Same thing for anything else we're doing.
No. Given the timing, it would be challenging, but it could be done.
It's not a public hearing, though.
I think this was identified on one of the 49 item list.
Then everything has been subject to a public hearing already.
Yeah, we're done.
We don't need to do it again.
To heck with them.
You know, the selectmen, we can send 5 copies of this report up to the selectman's office right now. And if the selectmen want to put this on the ballot for the May town meeting, they can do it.
Actually, just to be clear, that it wouldn't be the Maytown meeting. They'd have to call
You're right,
Special
they'd have
town
to call a
meeting.
special town meeting.
I think there's if we want to pursue that route, the timeline, the calendar.
I mean, for the May election, my mistake.
Right.
So.
Yeah, we need a special town meeting by March, by the end of March.
how much notice do you need for a special town meeting?
I believe it's 14 days.
Very tight to market it, to have people really understand what it is in the context of everything else.
Right. I think that's why, if we do want to pursue this, we definitely want to understand what the next steps are to present to the Board of Selectmen. We need to determine the public hearing requirements and firm it. We need to determine what are the next steps to present to the town meeting members and develop a 90-day execution plan. So this is what we would want to figure out what we need to do strategically to get this to pass, and also develop a communication plan, and then a campaign.
I think also you'd have to your point about town meeting, you'd really have to be able to have a discussion at town meeting, perhaps about some of the broader issues that we're discussing in order to maybe have everyone put in context. And are we going to be in a position to do that by the end of March?
So
Did I just hear you say, though, that you, as far as we're concerned, you don't actually need the committee to vote on this, and you don't actually need anything else from us? Is that?
Right.
But
We could
go
do.
talk about it.
We could do what we're going to do,
So,
or not do.
But it seems to me procedurally, there are a number of variants on that, right? One is, anyone in this room can just send it to the Board of Selectmen, right? That doesn't seem great to me, right? The second
Well,
would
it's a
be.
public record, of course, they can
Right,
just
no,
read it
anybody,
themselves.
right, anybody can send it, right? Not even in this room, anybody in Brookline or outside of Brookline can send it to them. You know, the second would be to vote to forward the report subject to minor amendments having to deal with what Dick has raised to the Board of Selectmen without a recommendation. And I think the third would be to say, you know, what additional information do we need in the fairly short term in order to send it with a recommendation? Not, obviously not yet knowing whether we would be sending it with what that recommendation would be. And I'd sort of not like to go with anybody in the world's allowed to send whatever they want to the Board of Selectmen as long as it's not illegal. But
As long as it's not ticking.
yeah, that sort of thing, exactly. Let's not go there. Right, so, you know, I guess I like thoughts on the other two.
I just, you know, we a month ago, whenever we put up, you know, the options and what have you, that had numbers associated with it, we've had lots of conversations, and it strikes me that some of what we've already discussed openly has informed the town and the schools about how to structure the bridge budget. You know, they know what kind of, some of the things we're thinking about. It's not as if we're operating in a vacuum. So to the extent that the Board of Selectmen know that this is kind of on the table and that we're thinking about it and they decide that they'd like to take some action on it, you know, what else do we need to do, really, as a group?
But we need to formally recommend.
I don't think we do.
Well, I think
We
it
haven't
can- yeah.
formally recommended anything.
We haven't formally recommended, no, I think that it, right, just to pick up on Cliff's point, I think there has been at least a tacit distinction as we've been going through the last number of weeks, that if it's something that we just want somebody out there to absorb, out there meaning the superintendent, the town administrator, the Board of Selectmen, the school committee, to absorb, then absorb away. And anything that we've been talking about that would be this group saying we have an affirmative statement that we support X by a vote of whatever to whatever, that would be something that we would have more of a process around, that people wanted to articulate a sentence, they wanted to hear from the public, they wanted to vote, I mean, that, people were feeling like they wanted a little bit more process around something if they were being asked to vote on it, which is different from, as Cliff was saying, from, we're talking about parking meters, if you people want to do parking meters, go do it, we're not going to vote on that, and if you want to do it at $2, that's great, if you want to do it at $1, that's your choice, we're not going to deliberate and vote on that, and that if something we're going to vote on, do we need a public hearing on? And so one argument could be, we had the public hearing on it, and we're not doing anything except voting what we already had the public hearing on, given that nobody showed up on the public hearing on CPA, I don't think.
Or knew it was on the list.
Well, you know, that, I mean, nobody showed up on Putterham either, or, you know, so there are a lot of things people didn't show up on. So, you know, one can argue whether or not that was a meaningful public hearing on the issue. So I guess I would come back to the question of how important, let me ask it from a decision maker point of view. Would it make a material difference to the decision makers if there was a vote on this from this committee versus a general sense that this is something that they should consider?
Can I
Yeah, is there a
amend
different
that?
way to frame
I mean,
it?
there's the general sense, there's the forwarding of the committee report without recommendation, which means that it at least has formally gone from this committee, right? And then there's the recommendation. Right, I think there are three options, not two. So in 94, all subcommittee reports were brought by the chairs to the Board of Selectmen and were discussed, even though the committee did not approve, they accepted reports, it didn't approve reports.
it's a little bit of a tangent, but I think what's really important is that given that we are entering town meeting season and advisory committee season, I think it is quite important to figure out what of all of this needs to actually go to those entities to update them on whatever it is, and whether there needs to be an OSC update on where we are for those groups. Maybe there needs to be, for the selectmen basically know, the school committee basically knows, because they've been getting updates all along, but I don't think anybody's ever updated the advisory committee, or maybe you guys have been updating them. No one's updated town meeting on where we are in this and what does it mean for the next couple of years, given that there isn't a March 1st recommendation. So I think I would pull the camera back on that particular question and say, there's probably a moment this spring where we have to sort of summarize where we are and explain to people where we are in some more formal way, and this could be part of that. But I don't know. To my mind, if we're asking 15 people to vote, because Dick and I don't vote, if you're asking 15 people to vote, you vote after a public hearing. But that's my thought. You all can decide to do something else.
I mean, I just have a concern that, and I know it's not because you haven't tried to get this on the agenda sooner, because you certainly have, but it seems to just be coming out of left field in terms of public perception. And for me, it gets to the looking at things in pieces again instead of the whole. And if this is a good thing to do, as separate from the override study committee, then it should get done on that basis. And if it's part of the work of the override study committee as a way to save some dollars for the town, then I think it needs to be incorporated into the whole. That's my personal feeling.
Can I ask just a legal question about the vote itself? We've talked about sort of the coupling and decoupling and people having options. Can the selectmen structure the vote so that the vote must be on, override X and CPA or neither? Or do they have to be separate things that people can pick and choose?
They have to be separate.
Okay. That answers that question.
So let me ask the question again. Would it make a meaningful, is it important to potential decision makers that this body vote on this or not? Or is a general sense that this is important or a forwarding of a report sufficient? Because I think if that makes a difference, maybe we need to talk about that.
You have you still have two of the selectmen here. No, it's not a quorum. And I mean, I have not heard anybody here today say that the CPA is a bad idea or an idea that really should not be considered. There have been some arguments articulated about the CPA, the structure of the decision-making. One could argue about the nature of exemptions that might be granted under it. But the idea of free money per se is hard to resist. And the
Can you put that in the notes?
The idea that 10% has to go to affordable housing, we do that anyway. 10% has to go to open space. We would do that anyway, I think, and 10% to preservation might, in this context, given the requirements, might be the most problematical of those three requirements. I don't know.
Erin Shute-Galentine has informed us that she's pretty confident that we're okay on historical preservation because of parks that are historical.
Right, but the question is, you then have to do the work to the Secretary of the Interior standards and.
Right, which is why you don't want to do it on school buildings.
Yeah.
But it's fine for parks.
Okay.
It's actually
Okay.
sometimes cheaper.
So why not, this is just why not we say that this is an idea that we think deserves consideration, and we say that, and we forward the report to the Board of Selectmen, and at this point, stop there.
And then if they don't act on it, we put it back in when we're done at the end.
Yeah, and just to follow up, you know, conceptually, I think members of the board are certainly going to be open to considering the substance of this. I think the timing issue is the real issue. But I think forwarding the report accomplishes what you want to accomplish.
Do we need to vote on that, or can we?
It's public information.
No, but there's a difference before, I mean, Carol's proposal was to forward with a definite statement that this is worthy of their consideration.
Yes, that's,
Define worthy of their consideration, that we are asking, I agree with Dick, it seems in terms of the substance that there's no disagreement on the committee. So are we voting that we're asking that it go on a ballot as soon as possible?
no,
We're-
we don't.
We're not doing any political strategy on this.
That's not our role anyway, so we're
But
lucky.
It is what we spent the half an hour discussing. So.
Well, so we cannot recommend things that are politically dead in the water, but it is not our role to figure out how to sell the CPA or how to sell an
I
override.
knew what was dead in the water before it was in the water. I agree with people who have said that we risk voter fatigue. People will think they voted for the override and see their tax bill increase and think, oh, okay, and then the next year they get another shot.
They really
So
get
can
one.
That's, but that, maybe not, maybe not. I mean, that might not happen.
Can I
Okay,
propose
so
that we?
could I move the question? Just move it? Do we have it formed as a question? Simply the report for this committee? Carol? do you wanna phrase it?
What I said in the motion could be made that we believe that this is an idea, the CPA is an idea that is definitely worth consideration by the Board of Selectmen, and that we forward the report.
I object to the word definitely.
Okay, that we take the word definitely out. We can take definitely, take definitely.
means you're multiplying by one.
Right.
And then
Consider, right.
makes it back to.
Definitely worthy of some consideration.
Some consideration.
It's a
Considerable
non-zero amount of
consideration.
consideration that it is definitely worth.
Please read this. How about please read this? Okay, so there is all right.
Idea.
Regardless of whether or not anyone likes it, there is a motion. Is there a
There's a
second
motion.
to the motion?
Was there a second? I made the motion.
All right, that we believe that this is an idea worth consideration, that we forward the report to the Board of Selectmen.
Correct.
And there's a second. Is there discussion? All right, all those in favor? Dick and I don't vote. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All those opposed? Okay, so by a vote of 10 to 0 to 1, you don't call for abstentions. By a vote from 10 to 0 to 1, we are forwarding this idea, which is worth consideration, to the Board of Selectmen. Congratulations, you all have taken your first vote. It's very exciting. I'm sure there are all sorts of inappropriate metaphors I could make, but I won't. Congratulations. So, I'm so tired. Okay, so other potential revenue sources.
So one
Shane.
other thing that we wanted to bring up and discuss was the real estate transfer tax. Are there any questions of clarifications that you guys might have after reading the materials?
I guess I just had one, I wasn't clear on the recommendation side, how you picked the size of the tax. You had, at one point, you had an amount that would be raised with a larger transfer tax percentage, and then when you got to the actual amount, you said, we recommend something here, and I wasn't sure how you got from.
From talking to the town assessor, Gary, just to get a feel for what could work. But we did identify 4, and they could go up to 2%, 5%. I mean, it might be unpalatable at some point. So,
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, I just wasn't sure if there was if you compared with other towns.
yeah, the only other thing that I did that you didn't see is I actually took on Zillow all the sales. This is a question that Sergio had for me to better illustrate the typical amount. So I took the residential sales since November 29th, and I sorted in descending sales price order. So you have the highest up and lowest down. And then I've identified the same 4 just to get a better flavor of what the transaction tax would be. And it's 2 pages long, so you'll see that. And then, so some of the like single bedrooms, the 1-1s will be in the 400s if it's 0.1%.
And one other separate point, you mentioned in your analysis, one of the pros for this being that depending on how the split goes, part of the tax falls on a non-resident of Brookline. And I guess I would make the kind of counterpoint that anyone involved in buying or selling a home in Brookline, unless they're buying it purely as an investment property, is either a resident of Brookline who's leaving and paying the tax or someone else who's coming in. So I would definitely distinguish between that, and we talk, for example, about parking meters being paid for by people, and everyone loves hotel taxes because they get paid for by people who are far away. But in this case, where the tax is going to be borne either by people who are residents
That's correct.
until they pay it, or who pay it and become residents. So that's not necessarily a point against it, but I think it's a distinction.
That's fine. Agreed.
Can you talk a little bit about the split and what the custom is for that, and how, is there a required split, and then whether
If
it's.
it's a buyer's market or a seller's market, that's what happens.
Well, we wouldn't change it, and it wouldn't change over time.
No. Mechanically, it's paid by the seller.
Could be anything. New Hampshire, it's 50/50.
But whatever,
So my question is, what would we be proposing, and how much flexibility is there? I mean, I saw it was 50, I thought I saw in some places it was 50/50, but is there a lot of flexibility?
But my point is, it doesn't matter how you levy it. If it's a buyer's market, the seller is going to pay it, and if it's a seller's market, the buyer is going to pay it.
The seller always pays it, because it always comes out of a sale price. It always affects the economics of what someone can pay for a house.
I completely understand that. I guess just in terms of what you would propose and how it would be framed.
Right. We haven't specifically framed whose burden this would be. We just framed it as a tax that should be considered.
Okay, thank you.
Michael? Yeah. I didn't have much to add. I mean, I think there is, custom probably dictates what really happens. I don't know actually what the other municipalities in Massachusetts, what is the custom for splitting the tax?
Well, so this is the whole point about, this is the reason why we're talking about this, is we need to figure out whether we as a group collectively think that this is a good idea, because there's a lot of hurdles to get this to actually work. Because it requires state legislature. So we would, again, hunt and have someone else go through.
So why would we need to decide now? It's very long range. It's not going to be revenue that we're going to have, I would assume, even within the 3 to 5 years that we're ultimately talking about. So I'm a little confused as to why it's teed up now, separate from all the other things.
Because it's so long range that we just need a sense from our colleagues on the override study committee to see whether we should recommend this.
What would you say would be the short answer as to why this is better than an increase in the property tax? I mean, it's essentially taking, we need to raise X dollars. This clusters some amount of it in a set of transactions.
Right.
Which over a long period of time presumably gets captured about equally to property tax. So what makes this better?
So the way I personally view this is people love the Brookline school system. People love living in Brookline. So people may be willing to pay a premium to buy into Brookline.
They do, it's called the price of their homes.
Yeah, but it also doesn't hit everybody every year, right? I mean, right, exactly. So not everybody, and I'm not advocating for it or against it, but, if you're not involved in a property transaction that year, you're not dealing with it.
Yeah, but that's why I mean it sort of clusters it into lumps. So if if someone buys a house, lives here while their kids are in school or and beyond for some period of time, and then sells their house, instead of paying a property tax every year, they get involved in 2 transactions where that becomes it becomes kind of lumped in. So I'm,
But I haven't done the math, but I would expect that for any individual, that's going to be much less expensive than, well, because it's, the tax coming in and the tax going out, if you're here for 15 years, okay, as an example, that, if it's 0.1% coming in and 0.1% going out, relative to a property tax,
well,
because
no,
you have so much
clearly it's less
transaction
than a
volume.
property tax, but if you're going to raise X dollars from this tax, whatever
Right.
it is, and your choice is either to raise X dollars from this tax or to increase the property tax by that same amount over that same period of time, I don't see how one can be cheaper.
Yeah, Chad,
Cheaper for the individual, for any one
no,
individual.
no, for a fixed amount, I understand your point, Chad, and I think it's a fascinating question. I'm trying to get a PhD student to work on it. Because I hadn't really thought about it until this. I think there is a difference in the sense that the people who are buying in are probably disproportionately coming in when their kids are relatively young and are more willing to pay taxes in order to support the schools, right, than many of us whose kids have grown up. And so when I think I'd be typical. When I came here for the schools. I'm still here. And the schools, of course, I have no interest in any longer whatsoever. Right. No, but from a strictly selfish point of view, the reason for supporting the schools is to maintain my property values because I don't expect to sell my house for a long time. I have less of an interest. If I'm about to sell my house, I care about the property supporting the schools. And if I'm about to buy the house, because my kids are going to go to the schools, I may be more willing to pay it. So I think there's a difference in that there's a greater willingness to pay this. But as I said, I'd put a PhD student on this before I stated that as
Fastest growing segments are people who are long past their childbearing years. It's a very convenient place to live if you're retired. And so I'm not sure, that doesn't mean you do or don't support schools, but I don't think we can assume it's one demographic. I'm just sort of stuck still on the why now this piece, because a lot of the different policy things we've talked about may take a long time to get us anywhere. Certainly from the benefits people, we're talking about getting the legislature to do something about OPEBs and pension, and that ain't going to happen tomorrow. So doing something about it today instead of 6 months from now, I'm still not clear why.
Yeah, this one is to just give us additional guidance.
As to whether to pursue it?
Yes.
I think we should still be at the point of pursuing everything. If you think it's something that would raise a reasonable amount of money, that maybe 5 years down the road, if we can get approval to do it then, keeps us from needing another override of X amount, then, why wouldn't we continue to look at it? But I'm not sure why I would
Also,
isolate
what does it mean to pursue it? If what it requires is state legislation, right? So we want.
So what it means to pursue, let me try to answer that, which is that, again, we kind of said there's this basket of 40 plus, and then there's a smaller basket of about 20. And some of these are things we could implement right away, either easy or hard. Other things are things that we would say, by a vote of 15-0, this committee at some point says the selectmen should pursue these long-range initiatives, or the school committee should pursue these long-range initiatives. So it's not so much that this committee, does that make sense? So it's,
Yes,
okay.
it does.
Because I think that what we're going to end up seeing is when we get to however we decide to do our scenarios at the end, we're going to have this variety of costs. We could say, here are some efficiencies, here are some service cuts. We're going to say, here's what we could raise through fees, here's what we could raise through different types of tax mechanisms, a real estate transfer tax, a CPA tax, a regular general operating override. So I think the only thing this conversation is designed to do is to say, this seems like a big one. It seems like one that was not be implemented in the near term. However, the Revenue Subcommittee, Stop Me Anytime, kind of wants a sense from us as to whether or not it's something that they should continue to do analysis on and come up with a more refined set of thoughts on, because it might be in that final basket that we end up recommending somehow.
Can I speak against this?
Sure.
As a PhD?
Well, as somebody who does work in taxation.
But just all their
in
houses.
point of
what
fact.
is it?
So I've quoted from the Hitchhiker's Guide before, and what was the one I didn't know anything about the other day? Anyway, Spinal Tap. But I will quote from the Beatles. If you drive a car,
But it's
I'll
their
tax
50th
the street.
anniversary.
If you try to sit, I'll tax your seat. If you get too cold, I'll tax the heat. If you take a walk, I'll tax your feet.
This is taxing somebody who's taking a
Basically-
walk.
I was going to say, this is the use of iPad technology at its
Well,
finest. I
was
hope
just-
all of our
no, I
Brookline
mean, I
students
roughly
can do
remember
this
the
someday.
lyrics. I just wanted to get it exact. What I object to about this is that it is very spotty and disproportionate in its impact. And I think that there's a certain degree of unfairness about it. There are people who live here for many years and are basically never going to pay it, or will certainly not pay it for a long time. There are people who, for whatever reason, are here only a relatively short period of time. Maybe they own the house for 3, 4, 5 years, and they're going to pay a transfer tax at that point. It's not a it's a convenience tax. It's taxing your feet or taxing the heat, but it's not. It's not a fair method of taxation, and because it doesn't reflect anything in particular. It doesn't capture any costs for services that the tax is defraying. It doesn't apply uniformly. It really is simply a means of collecting revenue, and it's arbitrary, and I just don't think it's a good idea, and I don't think we should be supporting it. There are other ways to do it.
Can I just ask a question about, just because I want to understand this one better, unlike the CPI, although I've paid a transfer tax, I have to say that I didn't appreciate where the money went. I just was annoyed I had to pay it. So we keep saying because we support schools, can it be designated just to one thing, or is it more circuitous than that it goes into the, to the town side and?
So whatever happened would depend on what went to the state got through the state legislation. I think if this has any chance of passing at all, and I'm not sure it does, I expect that it would be similar to the CPA in that it would be designated for some precise purpose, one of which I would assume, if we were lobbying for it, would be school buildings. And I think it does make sense to tie a transfer tax to school buildings. The one or two places where it is used, it's used for a land bank. And I would assume that the process of adopting it would end up being similar to the process for the CPA. But that, anything we say about it is up in the air. What would the maximum amount be? I sort of thought 0.6%, because that raises about, at least in Brookline, about what a 3% tax surcharge raises. And given that the legislature was willing to go for that, maybe they'd be willing to go for 0.6%. Right? But you could also argue it's as much as what you found 4% somewhere, right? I mean, in other places, so you could look for a bigger number.
If you apply the tax to the seller, and you tell him it's for the schools, he's on his way out the door. So it's not exactly a compelling argument.
I mean, are you looking for, it's becoming a little bit clearer that you might be looking for direction about whether this is something to pursue, because would you develop these ideas more about what the split technically would be, where it would ultimately go, what recommended percentage you would have? I mean, is that the kind of thing, if there didn't seem to be a lot of support for it, would you not do that analysis? And if there were, would you do that analysis? Is that?
I think based on today's conversation, I would put this in the back burner as an alternative to lower the override at the, so when we bundle the various packages and present it, this would be a way to reduce the burden.
But that goes directly against what we've just been talking about. You're talking about a long-term, a long-term, we can go to the state legislature and maybe this can happen in the future. I think, to General Patton's comment earlier, that's explicitly not the sort of thing that can be factored into the override level.
But I'm saying it's an avenue to.
I'm not saying that means that it can't be done, but I think in a sense, like we can make a recommendation that this train should start moving. But I think that if we're talking about something that is years down the road and requires state legislative action, that's really all we can do. We can't factor that then into an override number.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that.
I think the question is, should this train start moving? I think.
Does it also require a town meeting vote to go to the legislature? Is it a home rule petition type of thing? Is that the process procedurally?
The guidance we've had is that it's very unlikely to pass as a home rule petition, that this is the sort of thing which would be general legislation, that the legislature would not be inclined to let Brookline be have a unique tax. And so probably the process would be.
Decades.
Yeah, you don't worry, you'll have sold your house before this passes.
So have you changed your mind, Lee? It won't affect you.
It's going to affect my kids when they sell my house after I'm dead.
My kind of question.
Is there any evidence of an impact on sale price?
The numbers that we were talking, it's too hard. It's too. It's kind of small, so
Well, yeah, I mean, in other communities that have established transfer taxes.
Does it have a depressive effect in the
Right.
communities that have established these taxes?
How do you prove that? You
No,
can't.
and
really-
maybe you
can't really
can't. Maybe you
prove
can't.
that.
I didn't know.
I'm a little familiar with it in Nantucket, but Nantucket is so it's unique. I mean, if you transfer property and you make that sale, that tax, it's a donation to the environment. You're saving the land bank. People sell their property on Nantucket because they're expecting to go to heaven, or they are, or they're developers, and it's sort of this punitive thing that you deserve to have to pay that transfer tax because you only stayed in Nantucket, and I won't attempt any poetry in and around. It's that transfer piece. It is for the land bank, and that's a value that's in the heart of every person in Nantucket. And I think it's very hard to compare that to a urban, suburban neighborhood like Brookline, where someone might come as a young resident, have a couple of kids and move. But, and I'm also concerned about, to Lee's point of fairness, senior citizens in the town who are selling and maybe moving to retirement, maybe moving to Nantucket, but who are
gonna pay it
moving.
twice.
Right, they're paying, that's a large piece, and for a lot of folks, that's their retirement, that's an investment, and I think that's problematic in terms of fairness, but.
Are there municipalities that have it, or just because what you had up before were counties, and they seem to all be in the Nantucket kind of bracket?
Yeah, those are the Nantucket. The ones that I had before were
Yeah.
Nantucket related.
But are there any municipalities in the state? So you'd be
It would have
breaking,
to-
you'd be forging really new ground.
Right. It would
No,
have
to
pass
be
state
clear, there is a
legislation.
transfer tax, that exists now, which is paid at the Registry of Deeds when you it supports the Registry of Deeds, and it supports other county functions, but
It's above. It's
Oh.
$4.56 per hundred. It's called the deed.
Those are your
yeah, right.
Oh, I mean,
Yeah.
you don't notice it.
But in response to Michael's question, I don't think there are any data on the impact. That's what I'd like a graduate student to figure out. But, sort of just speaking completely logically, if you collect the tax and you burn the money, you're going to lower housing prices. If you collect the tax and you use the money for things that people really value, you're going to raise property values. And
That assumes logic in the real
right,
estate market.
right, and that's kind of our goal as a committee, is to do exactly those same things with the property tax here.
So does this lead to the conclusion that this is not a front burner item right now to transmit to the selectmen with a recommendation.
Yeah,
I don't think we need it.
Okay.
scratch one off the list, we're down to 48.
We're scratching it.
Right. So let me poll the committee. So it's now 8:52, where Melissa is going to win another bottle of wine for me pretty soon on our over/under bets on these meetings. I'm down one. So we have a couple options. One is continue with our agenda, other potential revenue sources, and discussion of fiscal policies draft memo, or not. Okay, that's what I figured. So let me do this then. I think that might have been unanimous with a couple extensions, but I don't call for abstentions according to Robert's Rules of Order. So, okay, can I just have your attention for like one more minute? One more minute. Okay. So it seems to me that the next set of things that we need to do, first of all, I really appreciate everybody digging in to 2 meetings this week, to lots and lots of hours, and I think that there's at least a path forward now, which I'm hoping gives people clarity that this committee, Chad, will not stretch into infinity, but there will be actual dates associated with it. So it seems to me that the very next set of activities is to get these deeper dive report outs from the committees, and there are at least 3 that seem like we're more or less ready to have those. One is one is revenues, which we didn't finish tonight. The second is fiscal policies, which we didn't finish tonight. And then the third is maybe pension and benefits. So it doesn't mean that we have to necessarily vote on anything, but I do think that those are the 3 where people have said, we don't have a lot more to do right now until we really, really get the committee to wrap our heads around it. So I would propose that those 3 be the next 3 that we kind of wrap our heads around. I think the next ones after that are capital, which Lisa, you said the first week in March 5th kind of time frame might make sense. You can do this afterwards, but roughly that would be next. And then the schools model needs some time to work through, the schools committees need some time to work through the model, but that would be kind of early to mid-March, maybe.
One thing, I think you and I should connect, but there might be smaller issues on the school side that we might be able to talk about sooner.
Okay.
Yeah, so the population and special education task force has 3 scheduled meetings. We're tracking all the snow dates, so I don't know if we'll have one tomorrow or not. And we've already discussed a number of things, but we're going to try to circle back and tie down numbers for early education, extended day. I think we've shut down the discussion pretty much on kindergarten. We want to have some more discussion about gym use and that type of stuff. But I think as we go through those, we'll be able to, I think, come to some conclusions or take things off the table and bring them here, and then leave some of the more controversial ones for a little bit later.
So what's a good, sorry.
When are those meetings?
Well, starting tomorrow at 5:30, then next, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Then the next storm is Sunday,
And the
so you
next
can meet
one,
then.
Tuesday at 5:30, and currently.
Following Tuesday at
Following Tuesday at
7:30 in the morning.
Are the current schedules, so.
Okay. So that would push us out a few weeks anyway.
Kind of,
couple
That would get us,
Yeah.
we'd be done by the 25th if the weather allows it.
Yeah. And
So
we're
first
not
or second
meeting,
week of March?
we're not meeting next week.
Right.
So, theoretically, after you finish with the 3 groups that you've talked about, we should be able to start.
okay, so that's the first or second week of March, basically. But forget about everybody else. Does that work for you guys?
Second week of March?
Second week
Hopefully.
of March?
Yeah.
Okay.
Likewise, on the schools, if we have 4 or 5 things that we
could probably
Okay.
do at the same time.
And then I guess that leaves demographics. So let's say that there's, so fiscal policies, revenue, and pension benefits were 3. Our next meeting is February 26th and March 2nd. So somewhere between those 3 and those 2 meetings. Then the next week, our next meeting will be March 9th and 16th. And that would be kind of schools and capital, more or less,
Certainly to begin.
to begin at least, to wrap our minds around.
I think so.
Am I in the wrong month? Sorry, 5th and 12th, thank you. That was in April, 5th and 12th. Okay, And then that leaves municipal and demographics. And I don't know where demographics is, so.
We've been meeting every Wednesday. We've had a lot of meetings. It's an enormous, okay, I'm sorry, thank you. We have had a lot of meetings, a lot of hours. We have some contradictory data. I was just looking at a housing census this last week that said the percentage of school-age children is going down by 6% in metropolitan Boston area in the next few years. So we're trying very hard to get the data together. I will have something for some of you at least to read by March 1st. We don't have, and Lee, am I speaking for the committee when I phrase this well? I'm trying to phrase this. We don't have a lot of confidence in the MGT data.
I think you're being charitable.
And that would be. So but we're, in terms of time and expertise, for us to find an alternate tool is an enormous professional task. So we are working on those parallel planes to take a look at what we can, how we can gather the information that we have and describe some kind of tool that will be helpful to the town and to the schools in predicting trends. So we're working on that.
So I don't want to get into a big discussion about that. I appreciate that. I don't want to get into a big discussion about this.
You don't want another PhD demographics person? We can do the algorithm thing. Lee, do you want to start? Well, you can start with the algorithm thing.
We'll
Now that
start
she
with
really
the-
wants to hear it.
We'll start with the other committees, I think is the bottom.
Give me a date by which you want to come back to the full committee. Are we thinking end of March? I heard you say some draft of something beginning of March.
As chair, I gave my subcommittee the 1st of March, but we could use a couple of weeks. That would be fine.
Why don't we say end of March?
Does that work,
Yeah,
Lee?
that's fine.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Alberto? Yeah, end of March.
Okay.
End of March.
Municipal, when do you guys, can I have the microphone back?
Yeah, sorry.
Municipal, when should we slot you in?
Similar timeframe, end of March, April, whatever.
Okay.
All right.
So then I think we have a plan to at least get his first set of deep dives and then the first set of hopefully numbers, maybe not numbers, not votes, but numbers. And then we can take it from there. Does that sound reasonable for the next month or so?
Yeah, it does. And I just, from my perspective, the level at which we've looked at these issues for these last two meetings seemed appropriate to me. And I'm wondering if people have the same sense that, if we continue at this sort of depth, we would be doing our work.
I also found it very helpful that Alberto, I think 3 times, sent us the information to make sure we'd look at it, because then we could get right into the discussion and we didn't need a whole presentation. So to the extent that people can do that, unless you do it all at the same time, at which point it won't be read.
Susan, now that we have an agreement on the long-run number range, I will, incorporate that into the quantitative stuff, but I will also draft a narrative, and that I should certainly have done in another week or so. So that'll be available for distribution.
Right. And I would just say if you can draft a narrative that you think everyone would get behind, that would be helpful. And if you can't do that, then just make that clear.
Well, I think we're in agreement on the basic principles, so the narrative is just going to describe what the study did, and hopefully there shouldn't be any issue.
So I think what we've agreed on is the number and not the methodology. Is that right?
Well, the number trumps the methodology.
I think if you ask this group to vote on the methodology, we would be back where we started. If you ask them to vote on the number, we'd be in very good shape.
Well, the number trumps the methodology.
All I'm saying is when you're drafting a narrative, if you can draft something we can all get behind, I would be grateful to not do this discussion again.
Fine. I'm not sure what that means, but I'll do what I can.
I have no doubt you can make it happen. Lisa?
I was just going to say, I think that it would be helpful to lay out exactly what you just described on a calendar for us all to see, and then just to even block out, 3 weeks of discussion or, whatever, a general time frame that we think we'd have the public hearing, general time frame then of going back and or revising anything we feel we need to, the time frame of trying to get something additional work from the schools on the budget piece, because that we need to come back to at the end of March, just so that, because I really do very strongly feel that if we don't work backwards from June 30th about where we want to be and block it out for everyone to see, we're just not going to get there.
Okay. Dick, can we do that, or?
We could try.
And it will change, but
Okay.
at least we will know when we're off track, and
Yeah.
we'll know when we need to tighten up.
No, it's a great, it's a great idea.
And I'm certainly happy to take a stab at that.
Yeah.
And get feedback from
Get back to you guys.
the committees.
And to be clear, it's not in service of just finishing, but if that's our goal, we just need to work.
The only last thing I will say is, just back on the idea of who in town should be updated on what. I think, and I'm sorry that Alan left, I think it would be very useful to have a substantive update, at least for the school committee. We have not done that yet. It's been my dribs and drabs as we go along. So I think that would be very helpful for the school committee. I know the selectmen had a bit of an update a couple weeks ago. I don't know if the selectmen feel like they need another one. I know we're entering town meeting season. I don't know if anyone feels like they need an update on the town meeting side or advisory committee or whatnot, but I feel like there's such a wide range of issues, and because we're not hitting a March 1 deadline, if people need, not just we're not doing it, but some of the issues that are getting discussed. And
So maybe offline, could you, Cliff and I, talk about what you need for that update would be?
yeah, I don't have a firm date. I'm just saying, I think that they're asking the question of, now that the March 1 constraint is lifted, where are you going to be, what are the issues being discussed, and that sort of thing.
I'm just going to say that I don't know that there's really anything to do for town meeting, because unless you're going to start using the listserv to disseminate information, you're not going to get everyone together, and I would not suggest using the listserv for that purpose. And with respect to the advisory committee, to the extent through the next 10 or 12 weeks that issues come up in subcommittee meetings that need to be informed, we can certainly do that, but I don't know that there's a need for a formal update. I mean, we can see. What do you think?
Probably the night we do school budget, and that might happen in two parts. I know there have been, last year, we had kind of the overview of the schools, what was going on with the schools, and then there was another session where we got into the details.
But so can I ask you a question about that? Because so much of this has nothing to do with the school's budget for FY15. I mean, it does, but it doesn't.
In terms of the evening, we had the general discussion about where the schools were financially, what was going on with revenue, what was going on with costs. That, it seems to me, when we're talking big picture, it's an appropriate time for the advisory committee to get updated. We're not specifically discussing the fiscal 15 budget, but we're discussing the financial outlook.
What about the non-schools pieces of all this?
Right, so like things that the municipal committee is looking at and stuff like that.
CPA that we just talked about, I mean, just different pieces. I guess let me ask the question a different way, and I'm thinking on my feet, or standing on one foot. Would it be useful to anyone in the community, besides the school committee, who is asking for this, to just have a general update on the issues?
I think you could do that through the TMMA, when you could talk to Harry Friedman about the TMMA sponsoring a meeting and having a presentation then.
Okay.
But, okay. We could, the question is, what would that accomplish at this point?
I agree. I'm not sure that,
Well, I
I'd
think
want to do that.
Because on the floor of town meeting, there isn't going to be the opportunity for the back and forth and the give and take and the
Q&A.
There simply isn't.
Right.
So if you want feedback from town meeting members and anybody else in the public who's interested in having that type of back and forth discussion, I think you do it before town meeting in a forum sponsored by the town meeting members organization.
Yeah, I think this is more to sort of head off this whole random set of questions of where are you going with this? What does this mean? What issues are you even considering? I don't mean what are we voting on, and I don't mean getting ahead of where we are, but literally just where we are. And I think in the 2 meetings, I'm trying to be responsive to the fact that 2 meetings ago, we all sat around this table saying, nobody outside of us and our neighbor, maybe Janet's neighbors, know what's going on. with this.
They don't really know much.
And that we, at some point, Chad was going to chair a committee, as I remember, on dissemination and communications, and that whole thing fell away. So I guess.
Point of process, I don't share anything, I just take minutes.
I don't want to lose.
It was Jim who said he would be interested in participating.
Right. So I guess all I want to say is, do we feel, because I'm getting these questions from school committee members and people in schools community, and maybe that's it. Maybe town meeting members are not asking these questions, advisory committee members aren't asking these questions, but just pulling back and saying, here's kind of where we are and what issues we're looking at, and we're not doing the March 1st thing, but we're marching towards end of June timeframe, and here's what's going to happen in the fall, and ask your questions. And
So part of me says, town meeting members are residents and they can come to the, open meetings that we have and the public hearings that we have. And I'm just a little concerned that if you have a meeting for like the town meeting members, that it might get out of control. So I'm a little nervous about that, but yeah, it could just be me.
I guess. I guess if I were going to do it, I'm not sure that I would have a special meeting of the Town Meeting Members Association to discuss where we are when where we are is in process. If you put an update in as part of the TMMA's pre-town meeting discussion of warrant articles, they usually discuss 3 or 4 or 5 warrant articles before town meeting, and they have speakers on that. If they needed to fill out the agenda, we could
send you or Dick there to talk to them.
Yeah.
No, I take very seriously the fact that we have not, as a committee, communicated where we are and what we're doing. And so it's all well and good, and I can say this I have scars on my back for this, but it's all well and good to say, look, all these meetings are town meeting, are open meetings, they can just show up if they want to. But the reality is that people don't. I mean, with the exception of Carla and this very lovely woman who for some reason is still here. I really hope you're married to somebody on this committee, because there's no other reason to still be here. I'm committed to the fact. She's wearing purple. You don't have to tell us.
Can you and Dick decide what you want to do?
That's fine.
And just tell
All
us?
right, fine.
I would just like to say that I don't think presenting a laundry list as we did for the selectmen and was sort of in snippets captured in the tab is helpful, because then you just have everybody responding to the piece that they want to look at. So I would at least not want to do something till we had our 49 items pared down to something manageable.
And that, that's not inconsistent with the town meeting schedule. Town meeting is, May 28th, and the TMMA meeting usually occurs a week or two before that, when they discuss the warrant articles, so that is mid-May, and maybe we see where we are in mid-May. And
Can I say to Lisa's point, can we not see where we are in mid-May, but
no.
set some
some
goals?
For the purpose of whether we want to suggest being part of the Town Meeting Members Association forum. I mean, this would really not be part of what their normal agenda would be, because what their normal agenda is looking at some of the controversial items for that town meeting.
Right. But let me suggest that what's happening is there are lots of questions in dribs and drabs about what's going on, and rather than trying to respond to them in dribs and drabs, what I thought I heard everyone saying a couple weeks ago, back when we were still looking at a March 1 or a month ago, that it would be helpful for us to frame for the community, whoever the community is, where we are, what we're doing, and ask for questions in a structured format. So this might be a death wish, which is I'm getting the impression now, which fine, but that's different from where we were a month ago, and I want to respect the fact that that's not where we were, and if nobody wants to do it, that's fine.
I'm sorry, as I remember the conversation, that you're referring to, I thought about it in the context of the public meeting that we had, where people came and reacted to what they saw in summary that we gave to the selectmen, without really having the benefit of deeper conversations about facts. So to the extent that we're going to be having another public meeting, hearing, whatever it's going to be, where people will have a chance to talk, then I would like to find a way for certainly very controversial issues, for there to be an opportunity to give information to people so that when they comment,
Right, that's
that
fine.
they're
Perfect.
educated.
Perfect.
That's,
So
which is different than going and educating town meeting members about where we stand.
Look, I'm not even on town meeting, so this is not about town meeting. This is about sort of the community or advisory committee or whoever you want it to be, but it's that. It's the point is, how do we get out some of the facts and allow people to ask questions and respond to those questions, recognizing that it may well be a goat rodeo or whatever it is, that everyone's going to go in a different direction, but also respecting that, so.
It feels like it's building in, though, the time from when we pare down our list and we have the numbers to the public hearing, and
Okay.
that's when we do it. You know, because otherwise we're just kind of half recommending things and. you
Okay.
know.
We certainly shouldn't do it until we've all come to some broad, not so much consensus, but at least till we've had the chance to hash it out. Right?
Yeah.
And the things,
I feel like our list wouldn't look that different than it did a month ago until we've had the chance to really scrub it.
Right, right.
Like if we were to
And
do
at
it right
least-
now.
At least we'll all be informed in the same level when we have that.
Right.
Get together.
Okay. Keep it like that?
At the risk
Yeah.
of extending, we have not yet had a vote in the demographic subcommittee.
Right.
We've
Neither
had
have we. No one
meetings,
has.
but we really haven't had a vote. So I mean, we're not at any kind of
Did you-
conclusion recommendation.
we voted
But I don't think we would be remiss if we're going to look
maybe we
for
did.
support for a town meeting member, and if they're going to be part of the whole forward motion of an override, sooner rather than later, it might be a good idea to just simply send out a message to the Town Meeting Members Association and say, as concerned citizens, we understand that you have questions about what's happening with the override committee, and we want to say, and then simply say, we are in the middle of gathering information, whatever, and just make a one paragraph. And that soon. This is what we're doing, this is what's happening, and we are not yet at a point where we're making recommendations, and then tell them, at just the meeting last night, we made, and these reports will be ready in the middle of March.
That's fine. What I'm getting is a need for Q&A. And if the answer is we're not ready yet and we're going to know in 2 months, that's fine. But I
Yeah.
guess what.
But tell them, we hear you, we hear your interest, and at the meeting, subcommittee reports will be due in March, and there'll be public meetings then, and we'll try to orchestrate some time for Q&A. But let
In
that be,
March.
yeah, let that
Okay.
be out soon. Let that be out soon so that they sort of know and stop calling you. Maybe.
All right.
20 minutes
Does that
ago,
work?
you asked if there was a sentiment that we adjourn.
Yeah.
Making late.
But you need to tell us why you're here.
So my question is, advisory,
It's just get the list of